The room was unnervingly silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan spinning above. The Carter family sat around the dining table, their faces pale, their eyes darting between one another as though searching for answers that refused to materialize. The air was heavy, suffocating with the weight of what had just been exposed. "Is this some kind of sick joke, James?" David, James's father, finally broke the silence. His voice was trembling, though it was hard to tell if it was from rage, disbelief, or both. He slammed his fist on the table, causing the plates and glasses to rattle. James, sitting directly across from him, kept his gaze fixed on the table. He couldn't bring himself to look at his father, or anyone else for that matter. His palms were sweaty, and his chest felt like it was caving in. "It's not. It wasn't supposed to," James stammered, his voice barely audible. "You're telling me this happened?" David's voice rose, cutting James off. His face was flushed, and his fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. "With her? With your grandmother? How could you, how could she?" Emily, James's mother, sat frozen in her chair, her hands clutching her napkin like it was a lifeline. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't make a sound. She couldn't even bring herself to look at Margaret, her mother-in-law, who sat at the far end of the table. Margaret, the woman at the center of the chaos, didn't flinch. Her expression was unreadable, almost defiant, as if she were daring someone to say the words aloud. Her silver hair was neatly tied back, her posture straight, and her piercing eyes betrayed no emotion. "Someone say something," David shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. He turned to Emily, desperate for some semblance of understanding. "Did you know about this? Did you?" Emily shook her head vehemently, her voice finally breaking through her sobs. "Oh, course not. How could I have possibly known something so disgusting?" Chloe, James's younger sister, sat on the edge of her seat, her face a mask of shock and confusion. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it again, unable to form words. The revelation had blindsided her just as much as everyone else. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice calm and measured, as though she were addressing a room full of strangers instead of her shattered family. "What's done is done," she said. "There's no point in yelling or throwing accusations now. What's done is done," David repeated, his voice dripping with incredulity. "You're unbelievable, Mother. Do you have any idea what you've done to this family?" Margaret met his gaze unflinchingly. "I know exactly what I've done, David. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend it didn't happen. But I refuse to be vilified for seeking comfort when I needed it most." "Comfort?" Emily's voice was sharp, venomous. "You call this comfort? You betrayed your own family. You betrayed your son, your grandson." She choked on her words, unable to continue. James's head shot up at the mention of his name. "It wasn't all her fault," he blurted out, his voice strained. I was just as much to blame." The room fell silent again, the weight of James's confession sinking in. Chloe let out a small gasp, her eyes wide with horror. David turned his fury toward James, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't get to defend her, James. Not after what you've done. Not after what you've both done." Margaret folded her hands neatly in her lap, her composure unshaken. "This family has been fractured for years. What happened between James and me didn't create the cracks. It merely revealed them. That's enough," David roared, slamming his fist on the table once more. "I don't care what excuses you have. This thing between you two ends now. Do you understand me? It ends." Margaret's lips tightened, but she didn't respond. James, meanwhile, slumped further in his chair, his guilt weighing on him like a physical burden. Chloe finally found her voice, though it was barely above a whisper. "How long?" she asked, her eyes darting between James and Margaret. "How long has this been going on?" James hesitated, his throat dry. "A few months," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Emily buried her face in her hands, sobbing openly. Chloe's face twisted in disgust, and David looked like he was on the verge of exploding. "You're not staying in this house," David said coldly, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. He pointed a finger at Margaret. "You're leaving. Tonight." "And where would you have me go, David?" Margaret asked, her tone icy. "This is my home too." "Not anymore," David shot back. "Pack your things and leave. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." Margaret stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She looked around the table, her eyes lingering on James for a moment before turning back to David. "If that's what you want," she said simply. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving the family to sit in the wreckage of their shattered trust. The door slammed shut behind Margaret, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The Carter family remained frozen at the table, their expressions a mixture of shock, anger, and despair. James stared blankly at the tablecloth, his heart pounding as though it were trying to escape his chest. He could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on him, accusing, disappointed, and utterly broken. Chloe was the first to break the silence. How could you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands were clenched into fists on the table, her knuckles white. "You were supposed to be better than this, James. You're my big brother. You were supposed to set an example, not—" She choked on her words, unable to continue. James looked up at her, his eyes filled with guilt. I didn't mean for it to happen," he said weakly. It just did." "That's not an answer," Chloe snapped, her voice rising. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and stood. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've destroyed this family." "Chloe, please," Emily said, her voice shaky as she reached out to her daughter. "Let's not make this worse." "Worse?" Chloe spun around to face her mother, her face twisted in anger. "How could it possibly be worse? Our family is ruined, Mom. And you're just sitting there like this is some bad dream we'll all wake up from." Emily flinched at Chloe's words, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't fix it," David said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. He stood abruptly, the chair tipping slightly before settling back on its legs. "This isn't something we can just sweep under the rug, Emily. This is beyond anything I could have imagined." He turned to James, his expression hard and unyielding. "You need to tell us everything," he demanded. "How did this start? When? Why?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the betrayal evident in his tone. James swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt like a child again, caught doing something wrong and facing the wrath of his father. But this wasn't a broken window or a bad grade. This was something far worse. He hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to find the right words. "It started after Grandpa died," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "I moved in with Grandma to help her, you know? She was so lonely, and I just wanted to be there for her. And that's how this happened." David's voice was cold, his eyes narrowing. "Because she was lonely." "It wasn't like that," James said quickly, shaking his head. "At first it was just talking. We'd sit together in the evenings and talk about Grandpa, about life. She'd tell me stories about when you were a kid, Dad. Felt nice, like we were helping each other heal." Emily's sobs grew louder, and Chloe covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as she cried silently. David remained silent, his jaw clenched as he waited for James to continue. "But then things started to change," James admitted, his voice trembling. "It was subtle at first, little things. She'd hold my hand a bit longer than usual, or she'd hug me and it felt different. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back," he trailed off, unable to finish the thought. David slammed his hand on the table, making everyone jump. "And you didn't think to stop it? To tell someone?" "I didn't know what to do," James said desperately. "I was confused, okay? I didn't want to hurt her, and I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could handle it, but he buried his face in his hands. His voice muffled as he added, I was wrong. David took a deep breath, his shoulders rising and falling as he tried to keep his temper in check. What exactly happened between you two, James? I want the truth. James hesitated, his stomach twisting into knots. He knew there was no point in lying. His father wouldn't believe him anyway. It happened one night, he said finally. We were watching a movie and she kissed me. Chloe let out a strangled cry, and Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David's expression darkened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. It wasn't just a kiss, James admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Things went further than that. Stop, Emily said suddenly, her voice shaky but firm. I can't listen to this. David turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Emily. No, she said, shaking her head. I need a moment. She stood and quickly left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. The remaining three sat in tense silence, the weight of James's confession hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Chloe spoke, her voice barely audible. You should leave, she said, not looking at him. Just go. James felt a pang of sadness at her words but didn't argue. He stood slowly, his movements sluggish as though he were moving through water. Without another word, he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. David and Chloe remained at the table, the silence between them filled with unspoken words. David stared at the spot where James had been sitting, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't articulate. Chloe wiped her tears away angrily, her hands shaking as she tried to steady herself. What do we do now? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. David didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. I don't know, he admitted, but we'll figure it out. Somehow. The silence in the Carter household was deafening in the days following the explosive confrontation. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful but heavy, oppressive, and filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Everyone moved through the house as though navigating a minefield, avoiding each other's gazes and speaking only when absolutely necessary. Emily spent most of her time in the kitchen, scrubbing the counters or organizing the pantry, tasks she had already completed but returned to as a distraction. Her mind raced with a million questions she didn't have the answers to. How had she missed the signs? How could her own mother betray her family like this? The pain was relentless, a constant ache in her chest that refused to subside. Chloe, on the other hand, retreated to her room. She threw herself into schoolwork and buried her head in books, hoping that if she ignored the chaos long enough, it would simply disappear. But no amount of studying could erase the image of her brother sitting at the table, confessing to something that had shattered the family she thought she knew. David was perhaps the most visibly affected. He avoided the house entirely, spending long hours at work or taking aimless drives through the city. He couldn't bring himself to face Emily, Chloe, or even James. The betrayal burned like a fire in his chest, and no matter how much he tried to push it down, it consumed him. James, meanwhile, was a ghost of his former self. He stayed in his room most of the time, emerging only when the others were out of sight. The guilt was suffocating, a relentless weight pressing down on him. He replayed the events over and over in his mind, questioning how things had spiraled so far out of control. He thought about leaving, but where would he go? How could he face the world knowing what he had done? The breaking point came one evening when David returned home after a long day. The house was eerily quiet as it had been for days, but this time he decided he'd had enough. He walked into the living room where Emily was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. We need to talk, he said firmly, his voice cutting through the silence. Emily looked up at him, her eyes red from hours of crying. About what? About everything, David said, sitting down across from her. We can't keep pretending this isn't happening. We need to figure out what we're going to do. Emily let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling. I don't know what to do, David. I feel like I'm drowning. David's expression softened, though the anger in his eyes hadn't entirely faded. I know, he said. Feel the same way. But we have to figure this out, for Chloe's sake if nothing else. Emily nodded, wiping her tears away. Do you think there's any way we can fix this? Or is it too late? David hesitated, his jaw tightening. I don't know, he admitted. But we can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. We need to confront it. Together. The next day, David called a family meeting. Chloe sat on the couch with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and frustration. Emily sat beside her, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while David stood near the fireplace, his posture tense. James entered the room hesitantly, his eyes downcast as he took a seat in the armchair. We're going to talk about this, David began, his voice steady but firm. And I don't want anyone walking away until we've said everything that needs to be said. Chloe rolled her eyes. What's there to talk about? We all know what happened. James and Grandma destroyed this family. End of story. Chloe, Emily said softly, placing a hand on her daughter's arm. This isn't just about pointing fingers. We need to figure out how to move forward. Chloe pulled her arm away, her expression hard. Move forward. How are we supposed to do that when everything's already ruined? James cleared his throat, his voice trembling as he spoke. I know I've hurt all of you, he said. And I hate myself for it. If I could take it back, I would. But I can't. All I can do is try to make things right. How? Chloe snapped, her eyes narrowing. How could you possibly make this right? James looked at her, his guilt evident in his expression. I don't know, he admitted. But I'll do whatever it takes. David crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on James. The first thing you can do is tell us everything. No more half-truths. We deserve to know the full story. James hesitated, his stomach churning. But he knew his father was right. If they were ever going to move past this, the truth had to come out. James began to recount the events that had led to this moment, his voice shaking as he spoke. He talked about the nights he spent with Margaret after his grandfather's death, how their shared grief had brought them closer, and how the lines between them had begun to blur. He described the first kiss, the confusion and guilt that followed, and the moments when he wanted to stop but didn't know how. As James spoke, Emily's tears flowed freely, and Chloe stared at him in stunned silence. David remained stoic, though his clenched fists betrayed the storm of emotions raging within him. When James finished, the room fell silent. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air, suffocating and inescapable. You've broken this family, David said finally, his voice low and filled with anger. And I don't know if we'll ever recover from it. I'm sorry, James whispered, his voice barely audible. I know that's not enough, but I am. Sorry doesn't fix this, Chloe said coldly. Sorry doesn't undo what you've done. David sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. We need time, he said. Time to process this, to figure out where we go from here. Emily nodded, her voice trembling as she spoke. I think we all need space. Maybe some distance will help us see things more clearly. David looked at James, his expression hard. You should leave for a while. Stay with a friend or find somewhere else to go. But you can't stay here. James nodded slowly, his heart sinking. He knew his father was right. Staying in the house would only make things worse. As the meeting ended, the family dispersed, each of them retreating to their own corners of the house. The path forward was unclear, but one thing was certain. The fallout from the truth was far from over. Margaret sat alone in the guest house at the far end of the property, the small space quiet except for the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. The air felt heavy, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her. She had been cast out of the family home, yet her mind lingered on everything that had unfolded. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to confront her actions, and the devastating consequences they had wrought. She stared at the framed photograph on the table beside her, a picture of her late husband, Robert, taken on their 40th wedding anniversary. His warm smile and twinkling eyes seemed to mock her from the frame, a cruel reminder of the life she had once cherished and the man she had betrayed, even in death. "Robert," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What would you think of me now?" Margaret's thoughts drifted back to the day James moved in with her. It had been a decision born out of practicality and compassion. Her grief was all-consuming, and James had offered to help her navigate the overwhelming emptiness left by Robert's passing. At first, his presence had been a comfort. They spent hours reminiscing about Robert, sharing laughter and tears as they pieced together memories of the man they had both loved so deeply. But somewhere along the way the lines blurred. Margaret couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but what started as a bond forged through shared loss evolved into something far more dangerous. Perhaps it was the way James listened to her, truly listened, in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Or perhaps it was the way he filled the void that Robert's absence had left behind, a void she hadn't realized was so vast. She thought about the first time she crossed the line. It had been an unassuming evening, much like any other. They were sitting on the couch, a movie playing in the background, their conversation drifting from one topic to another. She had placed a hand on his knee, a simple, comforting gesture, but when he didn't pull away, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in decades. That flicker grew into a flame, consuming her rationality and sense of propriety. She convinced herself that what they shared was unique, something no one else could understand. But now, sitting alone in the dimly lit guesthouse, she realized the truth. She had allowed her loneliness and grief to blind her to the damage she was causing. The sound of a knock at the door startled Margaret out of her thoughts. She hesitated before rising, her heart pounding as she opened the door to find Emily standing on the porch. Emily's face was pale, her eyes red from crying, but her expression was unreadable. "Can I come in?" Emily asked softly. Margaret stepped aside, nodding. "Of course." Emily entered the small space, her gaze sweeping over the room before settling on her mother. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the tension between them palpable. "I don't even know where to start," Emily admitted, her voice trembling. You've destroyed everything, Mom." "Everything?" Margaret flinched at her daughter's words, her guilt weighing heavily on her. "I know," she said quietly. "And I'm so sorry, Emily. I never meant for any of this to happen. Never meant for it to happen," Emily repeated, her voice rising with anger. "How does something like this just happen? You're my mother, James's grandmother. Do you even understand what you've done to us?" Margaret's shoulders slumped, her hands trembling as she clasped them together. "I do," she said. "And I hate myself for it. But Emily, you have to understand, I was so lost after Robert died. I didn't know how to cope. And James, he was there for me in a way no one else was." "That doesn't justify what you did," Emily said sharply. "You had a choice, Mom. You could have stopped it, but you didn't." "I know," Margaret whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Failed you. I failed everyone." Emily took a shaky breath, her anger giving way to exhaustion. "I don't even know if I can forgive you," she admitted. "But I need to understand." "Why? Why him?" Margaret hesitated, her mind racing as she searched for the right words. "Because he reminded me of Robert," she said finally. "The way he spoke, the way he cared. It was like having a piece of your father back. I let that cloud my judgment." Emily's expression softened slightly, but her pain was still evident. "You let your grief destroy this family," she said. "And now we're all left to pick up the pieces." Margaret nodded, her guilt overwhelming. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Emily. But I want you to know that I never stopped loving this family. And I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "I don't even know what making things right looks like anymore," she said. "But if you want to start, you need to leave. For good." Margaret's heart sank, but she nodded. "If that's what you need, I'll go." The next morning, Margaret packed her belongings into a small suitcase. She didn't say goodbye to James, Chloe, or David. She didn't think they'd want to see her. As she stood on the porch of the guest house, she took one last look at the family home, her heart heavy with regret. With a deep breath, she turned and walked down the driveway, the suitcase bumping along behind her. She didn't know where she was going or what the future held, but she knew one thing: she couldn't stay. Not after everything she had done. As she disappeared down the street, the house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the tension that had gripped it for days finally beginning to ease. But the scars left behind by Margaret's actions would take much longer to heal. James sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the floor. The silence of the house was oppressive, broken only by the faint creaks of the old wooden floors. His grandmother was gone, his family shattered, and he was left with a crushing guilt that seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. He thought back to the moment Margaret walked out of the house, suitcase in hand, her figure retreating down the driveway until she disappeared from view. He hadn't said goodbye, hadn't even seen her off. The weight of his actions was a storm raging in his chest, and he didn't know how to face the wreckage he had caused. The first step on his path to redemption came unexpectedly. One morning, as James sat in his room, the door creaked open, and Chloe appeared in the doorway. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was guarded, but she didn't leave immediately like she usually did. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tight. James nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He gestured to the chair near his desk, but Chloe shook her head, staying where she was. "I don't understand you," she began, her words sharp and direct. "You were supposed to be the one I could look up to, the one who kept this family together. And now I can't even look at you without feeling sick." James flinched at her words but forced himself to meet her gaze. "I know," he said quietly. "I failed you. Failed everyone. And I don't expect you to forgive me." "Good," Chloe snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Because I don't. Not right now." There was a long pause before she continued, her tone softening slightly. "But I want to understand. How did this even happen? How did you let it get this far?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted. "I was confused. She was grieving and I thought I was helping her. But somewhere along the way things got blurry. I made mistakes, Chloe. Horrible mistakes." Chloe's expression hardened again. "That's putting it lightly." James nodded, his voice trembling as he spoke. "No. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Chloe stared at him for a long moment, her emotions warring on her face. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and turned to leave. "I don't know if you can," she said over her shoulder. "But I guess we'll see." That conversation marked a turning point for James. He realized that redemption wouldn't come easily, and it wouldn't come quickly. If he wanted to regain even a shred of his family's trust, he would have to work tirelessly to prove that he was capable of change. The first step was finding a way to apologize, to truly apologize, not just with words but with actions. He started small, taking over chores around the house that had been neglected in the chaos of the past few weeks. He cleaned the kitchen, mowed the lawn, and even repaired the broken fence in the backyard. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Next, James reached out to his parents. One evening, as David sat in the living room, flipping through the channels aimlessly, James approached him cautiously. "Dad," he began, his voice shaking. "Can we talk?" David glanced at him, his expression unreadable, but he gestured for James to sit. "What is it?" James hesitated, his stomach twisting with nerves. "I know I've hurt you. More than I can ever make up for. And I don't know if you'll ever be able to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry." David stared at him for a long moment, his jaw tightening. "You think sorry is enough?" he asked, his tone sharp. "No," James said quickly. "I don't. But it's a start. I want to do better, Dad. I want to be better. For you, for Mom, for Chloe. I need a chance." David let out a heavy sigh, leaning back in his chair. "A chance," he repeated, his voice quieter. You're asking for a lot, James. I know, James said. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. David studied him for a moment longer before nodding slightly. You have a long road ahead of you, he said. But if you're serious about this, I'll give you that chance. James's next step was reaching out to Emily. She had been avoiding him since Margaret's departure, her pain evident in every glance and gesture. One afternoon, as she stood in the kitchen washing dishes, James approached her hesitantly. "Mom," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the running water. Emily froze for a moment before turning to face him. Her eyes were red, and her expression was weary. "What is it, James? I need to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I've hurt you more than anyone, and I can't even begin to imagine how hard this has been for you. But I want you to know that I'm trying to change. I'm trying to be better." Emily's eyes filled with tears, and she turned back to the sink, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "It's going to take a lot more than words," she said quietly. "I know," James said. "And I'm ready to do whatever it takes." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Emily turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "I hope you mean that, James," she said. "Because I don't think I can survive another betrayal." James nodded, his resolve strengthening. "Mean it, Mom. I'll prove it to you." James's efforts didn't go unnoticed. Slowly but surely, the walls his family had built around themselves began to crack, letting in slivers of light. It was a long and painful process, but for the first time in months, there was a glimmer of hope. Chloe paced back and forth in her room, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of everything. It had been weeks since Margaret left, and while the house had begun to settle into a new rhythm, Chloe's emotions remained raw. The betrayal of her brother and grandmother lingered like a shadow, casting doubt over everything she once believed about her family. She stared at the family photo on her nightstand, a snapshot from a happier time. Her father's arm was wrapped around her mother, James was grinning with his arm slung over her shoulder, and Margaret stood at the edge, smiling warmly. It was a picture-perfect moment, now tainted by the truth that had shattered their lives. The breaking point came one evening when Chloe overheard her parents talking in hushed tones in the living room. She couldn't make out the exact words, but the tension in their voices was unmistakable. It felt like they were hiding something, and Chloe's frustration boiled over. She stormed into the room, her face flushed with anger. "Why is everyone acting like this is normal?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Like we can just sweep this under the rug and pretend everything's fine." David and Emily turned to her, startled by her outburst. David stood, his expression cautious. "Chloe, we're not pretending." "Then what are you doing?" she interrupted, her voice rising. "Because it sure feels like everyone's just trying to move on without actually dealing with what happened." Emily stood and approached her daughter, her tone soothing. "Chloe, we're all trying to process this in our own way. It's not easy for any of us." "It's not about what's easy," Chloe shot back. "It's about what's right. And what happened wasn't right. It was disgusting, and you're all just moving on like it didn't happen." David stepped forward, his tone firm. "No one's moving on, Chloe. We're trying to heal. There's a difference." Chloe shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "Well, I can't heal. Not like this. Not when no one will actually talk about it." She stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. The sound echoed through the house, a stark reminder of the fractures that still ran deep within the family. Later that night, Chloe sat on her bed, staring at her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated whether to call her grandmother. Part of her wanted answers, to hear Margaret's side of the story and understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. But another part of her was terrified of what she might hear. Finally, she dialed the number, her heart pounding in her chest. The phone rang several times before Margaret's familiar voice came through the line. "Chloe," Margaret said softly, her tone cautious. "I didn't expect to hear from you." Chloe took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I don't even know why I called. I need to know why." Margaret was silent for a moment, and Chloe could hear the faint sound of her breathing on the other end. "I wish I could give you a simple answer," Margaret said finally. "But there isn't one. I made mistakes, Chloe. Terrible mistakes. And I don't expect you to forgive me." "Then why did you do it?" Chloe pressed, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why him? Why my brother?" Margaret sighed heavily, her voice tinged with sadness. "I was lonely. After your grandfather passed, I felt so lost. And James? He reminded me of Robert in so many ways. It wasn't fair to him, or to any of you. But at the time I didn't see that." Chloe's grip tightened on the phone, her emotions swirling. "Do you even regret it?" "Every day," Margaret said quietly. "I regret the pain I've caused all of you. If I could take it back, I would." Chloe let out a bitter laugh, her voice trembling. "Well, it's too late for that, isn't it?" Margaret didn't respond, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Chloe spoke again, her tone softer. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you. But I needed to hear this. I needed to know you understood what you did." "I do," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm so sorry, Chloe. More than I can ever say." Chloe ended the call without saying goodbye, her hands shaking as she placed the phone on her nightstand. She didn't feel better. If anything, she felt more confused than ever. But at least now she had some clarity, however painful it might be. The following day, Chloe decided to confront James. She found him in the backyard, tending to the small garden the family had planted months earlier. He looked up as she approached, his expression wary. "We need to talk," Chloe said, crossing her arms. James nodded, setting down the watering can. "Okay." Chloe hesitated, her emotions warring inside her. Finally she spoke, her voice steady but firm. "I talked to Grandma last night." James's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't interrupt. "She told me why it happened," Chloe continued. "And I still don't understand it. But I guess I need to know if you really regret it. If you're actually trying to make things right." James met her gaze, his expression earnest. "I regret it every single day, Chloe. And I know I've hurt you and everyone else in this family. But I'm trying. I know it's not enough, but I'm doing everything I can." Chloe studied him for a long moment, her emotions swirling. Finally she nodded, though her expression remained guarded. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said. "But I guess I'm willing to give you a chance to prove yourself." James's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you," he said softly. "I promise I won't let you down." Chloe didn't respond, but as she walked away, she felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a start. David sat alone in his car, parked at the edge of the riverbank where he and his father used to fish when he was a boy. The sun had begun to set, casting hues of orange and pink across the rippling water. He clutched the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white as he struggled with the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Since Margaret's departure, David had thrown himself into work, avoiding the house and the family as much as possible. But no amount of distraction could erase the image of his mother's betrayal or the guilt he felt for failing to see the cracks forming in his family. He thought about James, his son who had once made him so proud. The betrayal had turned that pride into something unrecognizable: anger, disappointment, and a deep sense of loss. David couldn't reconcile the boy he had raised with the man who had crossed such an unthinkable line. Yet, beneath his anger, there was a flicker of something else. Love. He hated himself for it, but he still loved James. How could he not? James was his son. When David finally returned home that evening, he found Emily in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. The aroma filled the air, a comforting contrast to the tension that had settled in the house. Emily glanced at him as he entered, her expression tired but relieved. "You're home," she said softly, turning back to the stove. David nodded, setting his briefcase on the counter. "How's Chloe?" "She's been in her room most of the day," Emily said. "But she came down for lunch, so that's progress." "And James?" Emily hesitated, her hands pausing over the pot. "He's been working in the garden. I think he's trying, David. I really do." David let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I just don't know if I can face him," he admitted. "Every time I see him, I'm reminded of what he did. What they both did." Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I feel the same way," she said. "But he's still our son. And if we're going to get through this as a family, we have to start somewhere." David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Do you think you can forgive him?" he asked finally. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know I want to try. For Chloe's sake. For us." David nodded slowly, her words sinking in. He wasn't sure if he had it in him to forgive, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding the issue forever. The next day, David found James in the backyard, pulling weeds from the garden. The sun beat down on him, and sweat dripped from his brow as he worked. For a moment, David simply watched, his emotions swirling. Finally, he stepped forward, clearing his throat. James looked up, startled, and quickly wiped his hands on his jeans. "Dad," he said, his voice uncertain. "We need to talk," David said firmly. James nodded, standing and brushing the dirt from his knees. "Okay." David gestured to the porch, and they both took a seat on the weathered wooden steps. The silence between them was heavy, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. "I don't know where to start," David admitted, his voice low. "But I need to understand. How did it get to this point, James? How did you let this happen?" James swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't have a good answer for you, Dad," he said. "I was confused and I made terrible choices. I wish I could go back and change it, but I can't." David's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. "You betrayed this family," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "You betrayed me. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." James's shoulders sagged, his guilt evident. "I know," he said. "And I don't expect you to. But I'm trying, Dad. I'm trying to make things right." David let out a heavy sigh, his anger giving way to exhaustion. "Making things right isn't going to be easy," he said. "It's going to take time. And I don't know if it'll ever be enough." James nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, David stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "You've got a lot to prove," he said. "But I'll give you a chance to prove it." James looked up at him, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "Thank you, Dad," he said softly. David nodded, his gaze lingering on James for a moment before he turned and walked back into the house. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. That evening, David joined the family for dinner for the first time in weeks. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, the unspoken promise of a fresh start hanging in the air. Chloe was quieter than usual, her eyes darting between her parents and James. Emily did her best to maintain a calm demeanor, offering small smiles and gentle conversation. As they sat together, David realized that rebuilding their family wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, patience, and a lot of effort. But for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope that they might one day find their way back to each other. Emily sat at the dining table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, as the early morning light filtered through the curtains. The house was quiet, too quiet, but it was a reprieve she had learned to embrace. These moments of stillness gave her a chance to reflect, to process the whirlwind of emotions that had consumed her life over the past few months. She thought back to the confrontation that had changed everything. Margaret's departure had left a gaping void in the family, and while Emily didn't miss her mother's presence, she felt the weight of the role she now had to play. As the mother of this fractured family, it was up to her to hold them together, to rebuild the pieces of their broken lives. Emily's first step was to address the tension that still lingered between her and Chloe. Since the revelation, Chloe had retreated into herself, her usual vibrant personality dulled by the weight of betrayal. Emily knew her daughter needed her now more than ever. One evening, Emily knocked softly on Chloe's bedroom door. "Can I come in?" she asked gently. Chloe's voice was muffled. "Yeah, I guess." Emily stepped inside, finding Chloe curled up on her bed, her laptop open beside her. She sat on the edge of the bed, hesitating before speaking. "I know things have been hard," she began. "And I know I haven't always been the best at showing it, but I'm here for you, Chloe. Whatever you need." Chloe didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at the ceiling, her expression distant. "It just feels like nothing will ever be the same," she said finally. "Like our family is broken, and no matter what we do, we can't fix it." Emily's heart ached at her daughter's words. "I know it feels that way," she said softly. "And I can't promise that everything will go back to how it was. But I can promise that we'll get through this. Together." Chloe turned to look at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Do you really believe that?" Emily nodded, reaching out to take her daughter's hand. "Do. But it's going to take time and it's going to take effort. From all of us." Chloe squeezed her mother's hand, her lips trembling. "I just want things to feel normal again." "We'll get there," Emily assured her. "One step at a time." Emily's next challenge was her relationship with James. While she had made progress in rebuilding her bond with Chloe, her feelings toward James were far more complicated. Every time she looked at him, she felt a pang of anger and disappointment, but there was also a deep, unshakable love that reminded her he was still her son. One afternoon, she found James in the garden, kneeling by the flower beds as he pulled weeds. His face was streaked with sweat, his hands caked in dirt, but there was a quiet determination in his expression that gave Emily pause. "James," she said, her voice tentative. He looked up, startled. "Mom," he said, standing quickly and wiping his hands on his jeans. "What's up?" Emily hesitated, her emotions warring within her. "I wanted to talk," she said finally. "About everything." James nodded, his expression guarded. "Okay." Emily took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm angry, James. And hurt. What you did, what you and Grandma did, it broke this family. It broke me." James's shoulders sagged, his guilt evident in every line of his body. "I know," he said softly. "And I'm so sorry, Mom. I never meant to hurt you." "I know you're sorry," Emily said, her voice trembling. "But sorry isn't enough. I need to see that you're willing to change. That you're willing to do the work to rebuild this family." "I am," James said quickly. "I'll do whatever it takes." Emily studied him for a long moment, her gaze searching. Finally she nodded. "Then prove it. Show me that you're serious." "I will," James promised. "I won't let you down." As the weeks passed, Emily threw herself into rebuilding her family's routine. She organized family dinners, encouraged open conversations, and found small ways to bring moments of joy back into their lives. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, arguments, and days when she felt like giving up, but she refused to let the weight of the past define their future. One evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Emily looked around the table and felt a flicker of hope. Chloe was chatting about her latest school project, her tone light and animated. David listened attentively, a small smile on his face. Even James seemed more at ease, contributing to the conversation with a quiet confidence that had been missing for months. Emily raised her glass of water, drawing everyone's attention. "I just want to say how proud I am of all of us," she said, her voice steady. "We've been through so much, but we're still here. And I know we still have a long way to go, but I truly believe we're moving in the right direction." David nodded, lifting his own glass. "To moving forward," he said. "To moving forward," Chloe and James echoed, their voices overlapping. As they clinked their glasses together, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she believed they could navigate it together. The evening air was crisp as Chloe sat on the porch swing, her knees drawn to her chest and a warm blanket draped over her shoulders. She gazed at the stars scattered across the dark sky, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The faint sound of footsteps on the wooden deck broke her reverie, and she turned to see James approaching hesitantly. "Hey," he said softly, his hands stuffed into his pockets. "Hey," Chloe replied, her tone neutral. She shifted slightly, making room for him on the swing. James took the silent invitation and sat beside her, the swing creaking under their combined weight. For a while, neither of them spoke, the silence filled only by the chirping of crickets and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Finally, James broke the silence. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to," he began, his voice low. "But I need you to know how sorry I am, Chloe. For everything." Chloe glanced at him, her expression guarded. "You've said that already," she said. "A lot." "I know," James admitted. "But I mean it. I hate what I've done to this family." "You?" Chloe sighed, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "It's not just about what you did to the family," she said. "It's about what you did to me. You were my brother, James. My big brother. I looked up to you, trusted you. And now," she trailed off, her voice trembling. James's shoulders slumped, his guilt evident. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly. "But I want to try. I want to earn your trust back." Chloe shook her head, her emotions bubbling to the surface. "You can't just fix this, James. It's not that simple." "I know," James said quickly. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I don't want to lose you, Chloe." Chloe turned to him, her eyes glistening with tears. "You already lost me, James. And I don't know if you can ever get me back." The conversation hung heavy between them, but James refused to give up. Over the next few weeks, he made a concerted effort to rebuild his relationship with Chloe. It wasn't easy. Every interaction was fraught with tension, and Chloe often kept him at arm's length. But James was patient, determined to show her that he was serious about making amends. One afternoon, Chloe was in the backyard, painting a small canvas on an easel. It was something she'd taken up recently, a way to process her emotions and find a sense of calm amidst the chaos. James approached cautiously, carrying a tray with 2 glasses of lemonade. "Thought you might be thirsty," he said, setting the tray on the table nearby. Chloe glanced at him, her expression wary, but she nodded. "Thanks." James picked up one of the glasses and took a sip, watching as Chloe continued to paint. "You're really good at that," he said after a moment. Chloe shrugged. "It helps me think." James hesitated before speaking again. "I was thinking maybe we could do something together sometime. Like we used to. Remember when we'd go to the park and play frisbee?" Chloe's brush paused mid-stroke, and she looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you care so much about fixing this?" James's gaze softened. "Because you're my sister," he said simply. "And I miss you. I miss the way things used to be." Chloe stared at him for a long moment before turning back to her painting. "I don't know if we can ever go back to the way things used to be," she said. "But maybe we can try." James felt a flicker of hope at her words. "I'd like that," he said. "Whenever you're ready." A few days later, Chloe surprised James by suggesting they go for a walk together. They strolled through the neighborhood in comfortable silence, the tension between them easing slightly with each step. As they walked, Chloe began to open up, sharing bits and pieces about her schoolwork and her plans for the future. James listened intently, grateful for the opportunity to reconnect. He shared his own thoughts and goals, careful not to push too hard or say too much. It was a delicate balance, but he was determined to rebuild the bond they had once shared. By the time they returned home, Chloe felt a small but significant shift in her heart. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step in the right direction. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, Chloe found herself laughing at one of James's jokes. The sound was unfamiliar but welcome, a reminder of the lighter moments they had once shared. Emily and David exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of surprise and relief. As the meal progressed, Chloe realized that while the road to reconciliation was far from over, it wasn't impossible. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps they could find a way to move forward together. The Carter household was slowly beginning to feel like a home again. The tension that had once gripped every room had started to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of normalcy. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of awkward silence, lingering resentment, and unspoken pain, but it was progress. And for the Carters, progress was enough for now. One crisp Saturday morning, Emily decided to bring the family together for an outing. It had been months since they had done anything as a unit, and she felt it was time to take a step toward rebuilding their bond. Over breakfast, she broached the idea. "I was thinking we could go to the park today," Emily said, her tone casual but hopeful. "Get some fresh air, maybe have a picnic. What do you think?" David looked up from his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "A picnic sounds nice," he said. "It's been a while since we've done something like that." Chloe glanced at James, her lips pressing into a thin line. She hesitated before nodding. "I guess it couldn't hurt." James, sensing her reluctance, offered a small smile. "I'll pack the frisbee," he said, his tone light. Emily's heart swelled with cautious optimism as she watched her family agree to the outing. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The park was alive with the sounds of laughter, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant hum of children playing on the swings. The Carters found a quiet spot beneath a large oak tree, spreading out a checkered blanket and unpacking their picnic basket. The atmosphere was light, almost reminiscent of their happier days. As they ate, the conversation flowed more easily than Emily had expected. Chloe shared stories about her friends, David talked about a project at work, and James even managed to crack a few jokes that made everyone smile. Emily watched them with a mix of relief and gratitude, savoring the rare moment of unity. After lunch, James pulled out the frisbee and held it up. "Who's up for a game?" he asked, his gaze flicking to Chloe. Chloe hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly, but then she shrugged. "Sure," she said. "Why not?" The two of them moved to an open field, tossing the frisbee back and forth. At first, the throws were cautious, the tension between them still palpable. But as the game continued, the barriers began to fall. Chloe laughed when James made a clumsy dive to catch the frisbee, landing flat on his stomach. James grinned, brushing dirt off his jeans as he stood. "You've got to work on your aim," he teased, tossing the frisbee back to her. "Maybe you just need to work on your coordination," Chloe shot back, her tone playful. Watching from the blanket, Emily leaned into David, a soft smile on her face. "They're starting to find their way back to each other," she said quietly. David nodded, his expression pensive. "It's a start," he said. "But we've still got a long way to go." That evening, the family gathered in the living room for a movie night. It was something they hadn't done in months, and the familiarity of it was comforting. Emily curled up next to David on the couch, Chloe sat cross-legged on the floor with a bowl of popcorn, and James took the armchair. His posture relaxed for the first time in a long time. The movie played on, but Emily's attention drifted to her family. She saw the way Chloe leaned into the light-hearted scenes, the way James laughed a little too loudly at the jokes, and the way David's hand found hers, squeezing gently. These small moments gave her hope that they could weather the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The weeks that followed were marked by continued progress. James took on more responsibilities around the house, helping Chloe with her school projects and spending time with David in the garage, working on small repairs. Emily organized weekly family dinners, encouraging open conversation and laughter. There were still setbacks, of course. Arguments flared occasionally, old wounds reopened, and the shadow of Margaret's betrayal loomed over them. But each time, they found a way to navigate the conflict, to address their pain without letting it consume them. One evening, as the family sat around the dining table, Chloe spoke up. "I think we should take a family trip," she said, her tone tentative. David raised an eyebrow. "A trip?" "Yeah," Chloe said, glancing at Emily and James. "Just the four of us. It doesn't have to be far, maybe the lake house. We haven't been there in years. Emily's eyes lit up at the suggestion. That's a wonderful idea, Chloe, she said. It could be just what we need. James nodded, a small smile on his face. I'm in, he said. It sounds nice. David hesitated, his gaze flicking between his wife and children. Finally he nodded. All right, he said. Let's do it. The trip to the lake house marked a turning point for the Carters. Surrounded by nature, away from the pressures of everyday life, they found a renewed sense of connection. They shared meals by the water, went hiking together, and sat around a campfire at night, sharing stories and laughter. For the first time in months, Emily felt a sense of peace. The road to healing was still long, but she believed they were on the right path. The fractures in their family were beginning to mend, and though the scars would remain, they served as a reminder of their resilience. As the fire crackled and the stars twinkled above, Emily looked around at her family and smiled. They weren't perfect, they never would be, but they were together. And for now that was enough. The house felt emptier than ever after Robert's funeral. The scent of flowers, once comforting, now clung to the walls like an unwelcome guest, a reminder of the man who was no longer there. Margaret sat in the living room, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring blankly at the empty armchair where Robert had spent most of his days. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, marking time that seemed to stretch endlessly. James arrived at the house later that afternoon, carrying a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His mother, Emily, had insisted that he stay with Margaret for a few weeks to help her adjust to life without Robert. James had agreed reluctantly, unsure of how to comfort a woman who had always seemed so composed, so untouchable. "Hi, Grandma," James said softly as he stepped into the living room. Margaret looked up, her eyes red and puffy from days of crying. She offered a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "James," she said, her voice hoarse. "Thank you for coming." James set his bag down by the couch and sat beside her, his hands resting awkwardly on his knees. "How are you holding up?" he asked. Margaret let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "How do you think? I've lost the man I spent my entire life with. The house feels like a tomb now." James didn't know what to say. He looked around the room, his gaze landing on the framed photographs lining the mantel. Each one told a story of a life well lived, a life that now felt distant and unreachable. He reached out, placing a hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You're not alone," he said. "I'm here. Whatever you need, I'll be here." Margaret's lower lip trembled, and she reached up to place her hand over his. "Thank you, James," she whispered. "That means more than you know." Over the next few days, James settled into a routine at Margaret's house. He helped with the little things, cooking meals, tidying up, running errands. It wasn't much, but it seemed to make a difference. Margaret's demeanor began to shift, the weight of her grief lifting ever so slightly. In the evenings, they would sit together in the living room, sipping tea and reminiscing about Robert. Margaret would tell stories about their younger days, how they met at a dance, how he proposed under a starlit sky, how they built a life together from nothing. James listened intently, his heart aching for the love she had lost. "You remind me so much of him," Margaret said one night, her voice soft. She looked at James with a faraway expression, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "How so?" "It's the way you carry yourself," Margaret said. "Your kindness, your thoughtfulness. You're just like he was at your age." James didn't know how to respond, so he simply nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thanks, Grandma." As the days turned into weeks, the bond between James and Margaret deepened. They spent more time together, their conversations growing more personal and intimate. Margaret began to share things she had never told anyone, not even Robert. She spoke of her fears, her regrets, and the loneliness that had haunted her even before Robert's passing. James, in turn, opened up about his struggles. He talked about the pressure he felt to live up to his parents' expectations, the sense of inadequacy that followed him everywhere he went. Margaret listened without judgment, her presence a comforting balm to his wounded spirit. "You don't have to be perfect, James," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset. "You're enough just as you are." Her words struck a chord in James, and he felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. He looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Thanks, Grandma," he said. "That really means a lot." Margaret reached out and took his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're a good man, James," she said. "Don't ever forget that." But beneath the surface, something unspoken was beginning to take root. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted a moment too long. Neither of them acknowledged it, each convincing themselves that their bond was simply the result of shared grief. But the boundaries between them were beginning to blur, and neither of them seemed willing or able to stop it. One night, as they sat together on the couch, Margaret reached for a blanket and draped it over both of them. The gesture was innocent enough, but when her hand brushed against James's, she didn't pull away. James felt his pulse quicken, his mind racing with thoughts he couldn't control. "Are you cold?" Margaret asked, her voice soft. "A little," James lied, his throat dry. Margaret adjusted the blanket, her hand lingering on his arm. For a moment they sat in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken tension. Then Margaret cleared her throat and stood abruptly, breaking the spell. "I should get to bed," she said, avoiding his gaze. "Good night, James." "Good night, Grandma," James replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As she disappeared down the hallway, James leaned back against the couch, his heart pounding. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. The days passed slowly, the rhythm of the household settling into a fragile routine. Margaret and James continued to share quiet evenings together, their conversations weaving through memories of Robert, life's uncertainties, and the strange comfort they found in each other's presence. Yet, beneath the surface, their connection grew more complex, a subtle yet undeniable shift neither was willing to confront. One evening, Margaret suggested they watch an old movie, a black-and-white classic that she and Robert had loved. James agreed, eager to bring a little lightness into their shared grief. The film's soft glow filled the living room as they sat on the couch, a bowl of popcorn between them. "Your grandfather used to laugh so much during this scene," Margaret said, her voice tinged with nostalgia as the characters on screen stumbled through a comedic misunderstanding. James smiled, glancing at her. "I can see why. It's pretty funny." Margaret chuckled softly, her laughter trailing off as her gaze lingered on James. The flickering light from the TV highlighted his features, and for a fleeting moment, she saw echoes of Robert in his posture, his expression, even the way he smiled. Her chest tightened, the lines between memory and reality blurring. As the movie continued, Margaret shifted closer to James, their shoulders brushing. It was a simple, seemingly innocent gesture, but it sent a ripple through both of them. James's heart quickened, and he found himself acutely aware of her proximity. He glanced at her out of the corner of his eye, catching the faintest hint of a smile on her lips. When the movie ended, neither of them moved. The credits rolled, and the room fell into a comfortable silence. Margaret let out a content sigh, leaning back against the couch. "Thank you for this," she said softly. "It's been a long time since I've felt this at ease." James nodded, his voice quiet. "I'm glad, Grandma. You deserve to feel that way." Margaret turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You remind me so much of him," she said. "Not just in how you look, but in how you make me feel." James blinked, caught off guard by her words. "What do you mean?" he asked hesitantly. Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's hard to explain," she admitted. "But when I'm with you, I feel less alone." James's chest tightened at her admission. He reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You're not alone, Grandma. I'm here for you. Always." Margaret's eyes met his, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hum with an unspoken understanding. She squeezed his hand gently, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you, James," she whispered. As the weeks went on, their bond deepened in ways neither of them fully understood. They spent more time together, finding solace in shared activities. Gardening, cooking, even taking long walks through the neighborhood. These moments felt natural, yet there was an undercurrent of something more, something they couldn't quite name. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Margaret paused to wipe the sweat from her brow. The sun cast a warm glow over her face, and James couldn't help but notice how vibrant she looked, despite the grief that still lingered in her eyes. "You're good at this," Margaret said, gesturing to the neatly planted rows of flowers. "I think you might have inherited your grandfather's green thumb." James grinned. "I doubt that. You've done most of the work." Margaret laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Well, you've been a good helper." James looked at her, his smile softening. "I'm happy to help. I just want you to be okay." Margaret's expression grew serious, and she reached out to brush a stray leaf from his shoulder. Her fingers lingered for a moment longer than necessary, and James felt a strange flutter in his chest. "I am okay," she said quietly. "Because of you." That evening, as they sat on the porch, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Margaret handed James a glass of iced tea. They sat in silence for a while, the soft chirping of crickets filling the air. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" Margaret asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. James turned to her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Margaret stared out at the horizon, her hands clasped around her glass. "Since Robert passed, I've felt untethered. Like I don't have a place anymore. I thought this house was my home, but now it just feels empty." James's heart ached at her words. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "You have a place, Grandma," he said firmly. "You have me. And this house isn't empty. It's filled with memories. Memories of him, of us." Margaret looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much that means to me." James gave her a small smile, his hand still resting on her arm. "You mean a lot to me, Grandma," he said softly. "I just want you to be happy." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. They sat there, the warmth of their connection wrapping around them like a cocoon, both finding solace in each other's presence. But as the night deepened, James couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. The way Margaret looked at him, the way her hand lingered on his, it was different. And though he couldn't quite put it into words, he knew they were treading dangerous waters. Margaret, too, felt the shift. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was just the closeness of their bond, the result of shared grief. But deep down, she knew the boundaries between them were beginning to blur. The Carter household had grown quieter as time passed. Emily and David rarely visited Margaret's home, leaving her and James to navigate their shared grief in solitude. What had once been a clear and structured relationship between grandmother and grandson now carried undertones that neither of them dared to acknowledge aloud. One evening, Margaret and James were in the kitchen, preparing dinner together. The air was filled with the scent of sautéed vegetables and the soft hum of conversation. "Do you remember when Grandpa used to cook lasagna on Sundays?" James asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Margaret chuckled, her hands deftly chopping herbs. "Course. He always made a mess of the kitchen, and then he'd sweet-talk me into cleaning it up." James laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "I think I've inherited his ability to make a mess." Margaret glanced at him, her eyes sparkling with amusement. "Well, at least you're better at helping clean up afterward." Their laughter lingered, filling the space between them. As James reached across the counter to hand her a cutting board, their fingers brushed. The touch was brief but electric, a spark that neither of them could ignore. Margaret's hand lingered for a moment before she pulled away, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Thanks," she said, her voice softer than usual. James nodded, his throat suddenly dry. No problem. Later that evening, after dinner had been cleared and the dishes washed, they found themselves in the living room. Margaret poured 2 glasses of wine, handing one to James as they settled onto the couch. To Robert, Margaret said, raising her glass. The man who brought us together. James hesitated before clinking his glass against hers. To Grandpa, he said quietly. They sipped their wine in silence, the room illuminated only by the flickering light of a candle on the coffee table. Margaret leaned back against the couch, her gaze drifting to the framed photograph of Robert on the mantel. You know, she began, her voice tinged with sadness. He would have been so proud of you. James frowned, his brow furrowing. I don't know about that. I do, Margaret insisted, turning to face him. You're kind, compassionate, and selfless. You've been here for me when I needed it most. Not everyone would do that. James looked down at his glass, his heart heavy with conflicting emotions. I just want to make things better for you, Grandma. You have, Margaret said softly. More than you realize. Her words hung in the air, wrapping around them like a warm embrace. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on James's knee. The gesture was meant to be comforting, but as her hand lingered, the atmosphere in the room shifted. James looked at her, his pulse quickening. Grandma, he began, his voice trailing off. Margaret's eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The unspoken tension that had been building between them now felt impossible to ignore. You're so much like him, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes it feels like he's still here through you. James swallowed hard, his mind racing. I'm not Grandpa, he said, his voice steady but uncertain. I know, Margaret said, her hand still resting on his knee. But you remind me of what it felt like to be loved. To be seen. James's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. Grandma, this doesn't feel right. Margaret pulled her hand away, her expression conflicted. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, James said quickly, though his own confusion was evident. I don't know what to do with this. Margaret let out a shaky breath, leaning back against the couch. Neither do I, she admitted. But I do know that you've been my anchor through all of this. And I don't know what I'd do without you. James nodded, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. I'll always be here for you, Grandma. No matter what. Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, but the tension between them remained, unspoken but undeniable. As the days passed, their interactions grew increasingly complicated. Small gestures, a touch on the arm, a lingering glance, took on new meaning. Neither of them addressed the shift, each pretending that nothing had changed. But the boundaries that once defined their relationship had begun to blur, and it was only a matter of time before they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. One night, as they sat on the porch under a blanket of stars, Margaret spoke up. Do you think people would understand, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James frowned, turning to her. Understand what? Margaret hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. How grief can make you feel things you didn't expect. How it can make you reach for something, someone to fill the void. James's chest tightened and he looked away, his jaw clenching. I don't know, he said quietly. But I don't think we should care what other people think. What matters is that we're here for each other. Margaret's eyes flicked to him, her expression softening. You're right, she said. And I'm so grateful for you, James. He turned to her, offering a small smile. Me too, Grandma. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The weight of their unspoken connection pressed down on them, leaving them both breathless. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, laden with an unspoken tension that neither Margaret nor James dared to address. The moments they shared, those lingering touches, quiet exchanges, and sidelong glances, had created a bond that had grown deeper and more complex than either of them had anticipated. But now, it was teetering on the edge of something neither could control. It was a rainy evening when the inevitable happened. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within the walls of the Carter household. Raindrops cascaded down the windows, and the sound of thunder rumbled in the distance as James and Margaret sat together in the living room. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the room. Margaret had prepared tea, the warm mugs resting on the coffee table. She sat with her legs tucked beneath her, her gaze distant as she stared into the flames. "You've been quiet tonight," James said softly, breaking the silence. Margaret turned to him, offering a faint smile. "Just thinking." "About what?" Margaret hesitated, her fingers toying with the edge of her blanket. "About how much has changed. About how much I've lost." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You haven't lost everything," he said, his voice steady. "I'm still here." Margaret's eyes met his, and for a moment, the flickering light from the fire reflected the conflict in her gaze. "You are," she said softly. "And I don't know what I would have done without you." James reached out, placing a hand over hers. "You don't have to figure it out alone, Grandma. We're in this together." Margaret's breath hitched, and she turned her hand over to intertwine her fingers with his. The touch was small but electric, sending a jolt through both of them. "James," Margaret began, her voice trembling. "There's something I need to say. Something I've been holding back." James frowned, his heart pounding. "What is it?" Margaret looked down at their joined hands, her voice barely above a whisper. "You make me feel alive again. In a way I haven't felt since Robert was here." James's pulse quickened, and he felt a lump form in his throat. "Grandma, Please," Margaret interrupted, her eyes glistening with tears. "Let me finish." James nodded, his chest tightening. "I know this isn't right," Margaret continued, her voice breaking. "But I can't deny what I feel. And I know you've felt it too." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and James felt his world tilt. He wanted to deny it, to say that she was wrong, but the truth lodged in his throat. He had felt it, the strange, inexplicable connection that had grown between them. "I don't know what to say," James admitted, his voice trembling. "I don't know how to make sense of this." Margaret's lips curved into a sad smile. "Neither do I," she said. "But I know that whatever this is, it's real. And it's helped me survive the worst time of my life." James leaned back, his head resting against the couch. The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the rain pelting the windows in a relentless rhythm. "This doesn't feel right," he said quietly. "But I don't know how to stop it." Margaret reached out, her fingers grazing his cheek. "Maybe we're not supposed to stop it," she whispered. The moment hung suspended in time, the world outside fading away as they leaned toward each other. Margaret's hand moved to cup his face, her thumb brushing against his cheek. James's breath caught, and before he could think, before he could process the weight of what they were about to do, their lips met. The kiss was hesitant at first, a tentative exploration of a boundary neither had ever thought they would cross. But as the seconds ticked by, it deepened, fueled by the emotions they had been suppressing for so long. The storm outside raged on, its fury a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, the silence was deafening. James stared at Margaret, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Grandma," he began, his voice shaky. I don't know what this means." Margaret looked at him, her expression a mix of guilt and longing. "I don't either," she admitted. "But I know that I've never felt more connected to someone. And I don't want to lose that." James ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "This isn't just about us," he said. "What about Mom and Dad? Chloe? What happens if they find out?" Margaret's shoulders slumped, the weight of his words settling over her. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I know I can't bear the thought of losing you." James closed his eyes, his emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. He wanted to protect his family, to preserve the fragile relationships they still had. But he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward Margaret, the connection that defied reason and logic. "I need time to think," he said finally, his voice strained. "This is too much." Margaret nodded, her expression filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I'll be here." As James retreated to his room that night, the storm outside began to subside. But the storm within him raged on, leaving him torn between the love he had for his family and the uncharted territory he and Margaret had entered. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The days following that fateful night were a blur for James. The kiss lingered in his mind like a haunting melody, both intoxicating and guilt-ridden. He avoided Margaret as much as possible, throwing himself into errands, chores, and anything else that would keep his thoughts occupied. But the house was small, and avoidance could only last so long. Margaret, too, felt the weight of what had transpired. She spent her mornings in the garden, pruning flowers with trembling hands, and her afternoons staring at old photographs of Robert. The kiss had awakened something in her, a desire she hadn't felt in years, but it had also plunged her into a turmoil she didn't know how to navigate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, James returned home from a walk. He found Margaret in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup on the stove. The smell of herbs and vegetables filled the air, but the tension between them was palpable. "Dinner's almost ready," Margaret said softly, not turning to face him. "Thanks," James replied, his voice clipped. He hesitated before adding, "Can we talk?" Margaret froze for a moment, her grip tightening on the wooden spoon. She set it down and turned to him, her expression cautious. "Of course." James gestured toward the dining table, and they both sat down. The room was quiet, save for the faint bubbling of the soup on the stove. "I've been thinking about what happened," James began, his gaze fixed on the table. Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles white. "And," James took a deep breath, "I don't know how to feel about it. Part of me knows it was wrong, but another part of me," he trailed off, his voice breaking. Margaret reached out, placing a hand over his. "James, I know this isn't easy for either of us, but I need you to know that you're not alone in this. Whatever you're feeling, I'm feeling it too." Her words were a strange comfort, and James looked up to meet her gaze. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret hesitated, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We take it one day at a time," she said finally. "And we keep this between us. No one else can know." James nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. "I don't want to hurt anyone, especially Mom and Dad." "Neither do I," Margaret said softly. "But I can't lose you, James." "I won't." In the days that followed, their interactions grew more calculated. They fell into a routine of secrecy, their bond deepening in the quiet corners of the house. Shared glances across the room, fleeting touches as they passed each other, whispered conversations in the dead of night. Each moment felt stolen, forbidden, and intoxicating. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, James leaned back against the couch, his head resting on the cushion. Margaret sat beside him, her legs tucked beneath her, a book open in her lap. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different?" James asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. Margaret closed her book, her gaze distant. "All the time," she admitted. "But life doesn't give us do-overs. We just have to make the best of what we have." James turned to her, his expression conflicted. "And what do we have?" Margaret reached out, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "Each other," she said softly. "And for now, that has to be enough." James closed his eyes, her touch sending a shiver down his spine. "It doesn't feel like enough," he murmured. Margaret's hand lingered on his cheek, her thumb brushing against his skin. "It has to be," she whispered, "because anything more would destroy us." But even as they told themselves they were keeping their bond in check, the lines continued to blur. The more time they spent together, the harder it became to resist the pull between them. Their connection was no longer just emotional, It had become something far more complex, far more dangerous. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, James stumbled upon an old photo album. He flipped through the pages, smiling at pictures of his childhood and the memories they brought back. When Margaret joined him, her face lit up with nostalgia. "Oh, I haven't seen that in years," she said, sitting beside him. James turned the page, revealing a photo of Margaret and Robert on their wedding day. Margaret's eyes softened, and she reached out to trace the edges of the photograph. "He adored you," James said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I adored him," Margaret replied. "But he's gone now. And I've been trying so hard to hold on to the memories, but they're slipping away." James placed a hand on hers, his touch firm and reassuring. "You're not alone, Grandma. I'm here." Margaret turned to him, her eyes glistening. "I know," she said softly. "And that's what scares me." James frowned, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her voice. "Why does it scare you?" "Because I've started to rely on you in ways I never thought I would," Margaret admitted. "And I don't want to lose that." "You won't," James said firmly. "I promise." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile, and she leaned in, resting her forehead against his. For a moment they stayed like that, the world around them fading away. The hidden affair had begun, a fragile and dangerous connection that threatened to unravel the fabric of their family. James and Margaret knew they were playing with fire, but they couldn't seem to stop themselves. The storm they had tried so hard to avoid was now upon them, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The hidden affair between Margaret and James continued to grow, but secrecy came with its own burdens. Every interaction, every shared glance, and every stolen moment carried the weight of their unspoken connection. The walls of the Carter household seemed to press closer each day, threatening to expose the truth they had worked so hard to conceal. Margaret woke early one morning, her heart racing after a restless night. She sat at the kitchen table, cradling a cup of coffee as she stared out the window at the rain-drenched garden. The once comforting routine of her life now felt suffocating, every decision overshadowed by the secret she shared with James. When James joined her, his hair tousled and his expression weary, Margaret offered a small, tentative smile. "Morning," she said softly. "Morning," James replied, pouring himself a cup of coffee. He hesitated before sitting across from her, the silence between them heavy. Margaret toyed with the edge of her mug, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever think about what we're doing? About what it means?" James looked up, his brow furrowing. "All the time," he admitted. "But I don't know how to make sense of it. I don't know if I even can." Margaret nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It's getting harder to keep this from everyone. I feel like every time Emily calls, she knows something's wrong." James let out a sigh, running a hand through his hair. "We've been careful," he said. "But you're right, it's exhausting." The strain began to show in small ways. Margaret grew more reserved during her phone calls with Emily, her answers clipped and hesitant. Emily, sensing something was off, grew increasingly concerned. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked during one of their weekly calls. "You've seemed distracted lately." Margaret forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to her ears. "I'm fine, dear. Just tired." "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" Emily pressed. "Of course," Margaret lied, her chest tightening. Meanwhile, James found himself avoiding his parents' calls altogether. The guilt gnawed at him, but he couldn't bring himself to face them. Every interaction felt like a reminder of the line he had crossed, a line he couldn't uncross. The secrecy also began to affect their interactions with each other. What had once been a source of comfort now felt like a ticking time bomb. Margaret and James tiptoed around the subject, afraid to confront the reality of their situation. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, James broke the silence. "How long do you think we can keep this up?" he asked, his voice filled with uncertainty. Margaret looked at him, her expression conflicted. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I can't bear the thought of losing you." James's jaw tightened and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I don't want to lose you either. But it's eating me alive. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice steady. We have to. But the strain only grew as time went on. Margaret became hyper-aware of every interaction, every movement that could betray their secret. When Emily and David visited one weekend, Margaret felt like she was walking a tightrope. James has been such a big help, Margaret said, her voice overly bright as she set the table for lunch. I don't know what I'd do without him. Emily glanced at her son, a small smile tugging at her lips. He's always had a big heart, she said. We're lucky to have him. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding his mother's gaze. The tension in the room was palpable, though no one dared to acknowledge it. Later that evening, after Emily and David had left, James confronted Margaret in the kitchen. That was too close, he said, his voice low but tense. Every time Mom looks at me, I feel like she knows. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. She doesn't know, James. She's just worried about me. That's all. James leaned against the counter, his arms crossed. I don't know how much longer I can do this, he admitted. It's like I'm constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. Margaret stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. We'll get through this, she said firmly. Together. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of their secret became increasingly unbearable. James found himself pulling away, spending more time outside the house and less time with Margaret. Margaret, in turn, grew more isolated, the walls of her once comforting home now feeling like a prison. One night, as James returned from a late-night drive, he found Margaret sitting on the porch, a blanket draped over her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with sadness. Where have you been? She asked softly. Just driving, James replied, his voice weary. I needed some air. Margaret nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. I've been thinking, she said after a moment. Maybe we need to take a step back. James froze, his heart pounding. What do you mean? I mean this, Margaret said, gesturing between them. It's consuming us, James. And I don't want to lose you, but I also don't want to destroy you. James sank onto the step beside her, his hands running through his hair. I don't want to lose you either, he said, his voice breaking. But I don't know how to stop. Margaret reached out, her hand brushing against his. We'll figure it out, she said quietly. But maybe we need some space. Just for a little while. James nodded reluctantly, his chest tight. Maybe you're right. The strain of secrecy had taken its toll, leaving both Margaret and James at a crossroads. They had built their bond on a fragile foundation, and now it threatened to crumble beneath them. The question wasn't whether they could keep their secret, it was whether their relationship could survive the weight of it. The days following Margaret and James's conversation on the porch were tense and filled with uncertainty. The distance they had agreed to maintain felt unnatural, like trying to live without air. Yet, neither dared to break the fragile truce, fearing it would unravel everything they had worked so hard to conceal. One evening, as James sat alone in his room, the weight of the silence became unbearable. The walls seemed to close in around him, his thoughts spiraling as he replayed every moment he had shared with Margaret. He missed her, not just her presence, but the way she made him feel seen, valued, and understood. The house, once a haven, now felt hollow without her. Driven by an overwhelming need for connection, James made his way downstairs. He found Margaret in the kitchen, her back turned as she wiped down the counters. The soft glow of the overhead light cast a warm halo around her, and for a moment James hesitated, unsure if he should disturb her. "Grandma," he said finally, his voice soft. Margaret turned, her expression guarded. "James," she said, her tone neutral. "I thought you'd gone to bed." "I couldn't sleep," James admitted. "I needed to talk to you." Margaret's hands stilled, and she leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "What is it?" James hesitated, his heart pounding. "I know we agreed to take a step back," he began, his voice trembling. "But I can't do this. I can't pretend like everything's fine when it's not." Margaret's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability breaking through her composure. "I miss you too," she admitted. "But, James, we have to think about the consequences. If anyone finds out—" "They won't," James interrupted, stepping closer. "We've been careful, and I don't care what anyone else thinks. What matters to me is you." Margaret looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You don't mean that," she said quietly. "You're young, James. You have your whole life ahead of you. And I want you to be a part of it," James said firmly. "No one understands me the way you do. No one makes me feel the way you do." Margaret's breath hitched, and she shook her head. "This isn't right," she whispered. "It can't be." "But it is," James insisted, his voice filled with conviction. "It's not conventional, and it's not easy, but it's real. And I'm not willing to give that up." Margaret's resolve wavered as she listened to James's heartfelt plea. She wanted to push him away, to protect him from the inevitable fallout of their actions, but her own feelings betrayed her. She had spent so long trying to suppress the emotions that had grown between them, but now, faced with James's raw vulnerability, she couldn't deny them any longer. "What do you want me to do?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Pretend like nothing's happened. Like none of this is real." "No," James said, his tone steady. "I want us to be honest with ourselves and with each other. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but we can figure it out. Together." Margaret searched his face, her heart torn between fear and longing. Finally she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "'Kay. But we have to be careful." James stepped closer, his hand reaching out to cup her cheek. "We will be," he promised. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Margaret closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I don't know how we got here," she said softly. "But I can't imagine going back." Their decision to continue their relationship, despite the risks, marked a turning point. They knew they were walking a dangerous line, but the pull between them was too strong to resist. They found solace in the stolen moments they shared. A quiet evening on the porch, a shared laugh over dinner, a lingering touch as they passed each other in the hallway. One night, as they sat together in the living room, James leaned back against the couch, his gaze fixed on Margaret. "What if we left?" he asked suddenly. Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing. "Left?" "Yeah," James said, his voice growing more confident. "What if we went somewhere else? Somewhere no one knows us? We could start over." Margaret's heart ached at the sincerity in his voice, but she shook her head. "It's not that simple, James. Have a life here. And so do you." "But that life isn't real anymore," James argued. "Not after everything that's happened." Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I wish it were that easy," she said. "But running away won't solve anything. It'll only make things more complicated." James looked away, his jaw tightening. "I just want to be with you," he said quietly. "Without all the judgment and the secrets." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "I know," she said gently. "And I want that too. But we have to be smart about this. We can't let our emotions cloud our judgment." James nodded reluctantly, his heart heavy. "I understand." Despite their resolve to be careful, the weight of their secret continued to press down on them. Every interaction with Emily and David felt like a test, every phone call a potential threat to their fragile connection. But they clung to each other, finding strength in the bond they shared. As they navigated their risky decision, both Margaret and James knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But for now, they were willing to face those challenges together, no matter the cost. Margaret and James's decision to continue their hidden relationship brought them a strange sense of comfort, but it also heightened their anxiety. Each day felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between the connection they cherished and the looming threat of discovery. The once quiet home was now filled with the weight of secrets, and the world outside seemed to press ever closer. It began with subtle changes in behavior that Emily couldn't ignore. During a routine phone call with Margaret, Emily's instincts kicked in. "You sound different, Mom," Emily said, her tone tinged with concern. "Is everything okay?" Margaret gripped the phone tighter, forcing a light laugh. "I'm fine, dear. Just tired. You know how it is." But Emily wasn't convinced. "Are you sure? You've been saying that a lot lately." "Yes, I'm sure," Margaret replied, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "There's nothing to worry about." Emily hesitated before changing the subject, but the unease lingered. Later that evening, she mentioned her concerns to David. "Do you think something's going on with Mom?" Emily asked, setting her coffee mug on the kitchen counter. David looked up from his newspaper, his brow furrowing. "Like what?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "She just seems off. And James has been avoiding my calls. It's like they're both hiding something." David shrugged, dismissing her concerns. "Mom's probably just adjusting to life without Dad. And James? He's young. He's probably busy with his own life." Emily nodded, but her unease remained. Meanwhile, back at Margaret's house, James and Margaret were growing increasingly cautious. They avoided being in the same room for too long when anyone else was around, and their conversations became carefully measured. But the strain of secrecy began to take its toll. One evening, while James was helping Margaret carry groceries into the house, their neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, watched them from her front porch. Her sharp eyes narrowed as she observed their interaction, the way James reached out to steady Margaret's hand, the way their laughter lingered a moment too long. The next day, Mrs. Peterson stopped by unannounced, a pie in hand. Margaret greeted her at the door, her smile tight. "Hello, Mrs. Peterson," Margaret said, forcing warmth into her voice. "What a surprise. I thought I'd bring you something," Mrs. Peterson said, her gaze darting past Margaret into the house. "You've been looking a bit preoccupied lately." Margaret's heart raced, but she maintained her composure. "That's kind of you," she said, taking the pie. "Thank you." Mrs. Peterson lingered, her curiosity evident. "It's nice that James is staying with you," she said casually. "He seems very attentive." "Yes, he's been a great help," Margaret replied, her smile fixed. Mrs. Peterson's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's good to have family close by. I'm sure the two of you spend a lot of time together." Margaret nodded, her grip tightening on the pie. "We do. He's been wonderful company." Mrs. Peterson's expression was unreadable, but Margaret could feel the weight of her scrutiny. When the neighbor finally left, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. "They're starting to notice," Margaret said that evening, her voice low as she sat across from James at the dining table. "Who's noticing?" James asked, frowning. "Emily." "Mrs. Peterson," Margaret said. "People are watching us." James ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. "What do we do?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping. "We have to be more careful. No more lingering looks, no more touches. At least not when there's any chance of being seen." James nodded reluctantly. "I hate this," he muttered. "I hate feeling like we're constantly under a microscope." "I do too," Margaret admitted. "But it's the only way to protect what we have." The close calls didn't end there. During a weekend visit, Emily noticed the way James and Margaret avoided each other's gaze at lunch, the way their conversation felt forced and unnatural. "Are you two okay?" Emily asked, her tone casual but probing. Margaret froze for a split second before offering a laugh. "Course we are. Why wouldn't we be?" "I don't know," Emily said, her eyes narrowing. "It just seems like something's different." James quickly chimed in, his voice steady. "We're fine, Mom. Grandma's just been busy lately, and I've been helping her out." Emily nodded slowly, but her suspicion lingered. Later she mentioned it to David. "Don't you think it's strange how distant they seem?" she asked. David shrugged. "Maybe they've just been spending too much time together. People need space, even family." But Emily wasn't satisfied. She resolved to keep a closer eye on her mother and son. her instincts telling her there was more to the story than they were letting on. The tension between Margaret and James grew as they navigated these close calls. They found themselves second-guessing every interaction, every word spoken in front of others. But despite the mounting pressure, their connection remained strong, an anchor in the storm. One night, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, James turned to Margaret, his expression filled with frustration. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," he admitted. "Living like this, constantly looking over our shoulders, it's exhausting." Margaret reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know," she said softly. "But we have to be strong. We have to protect this." James looked into her eyes, his resolve hardening. "We will. No matter what." The strain of secrecy and the constant threat of discovery only served to deepen their bond. But the cracks in their carefully constructed facade were beginning to show, and it was only a matter of time before someone uncovered the truth. Margaret and James had been walking a razor-thin line, balancing their hidden relationship with the demands of family and community. The growing suspicion from Emily, Mrs. Peterson, and even David began to weigh heavily on them. The carefully maintained mask they wore in public started to slip, revealing the cracks beneath. It began with an offhand comment from Chloe during a family dinner. "You two are spending a lot of time together," Chloe remarked, glancing between James and Margaret. "You're like best friends now." The words were innocent enough, but Emily's ears perked up. She studied her son and mother carefully, noting the subtle way James's eyes darted toward Margaret and the slight flush that appeared on Margaret's cheeks. "Well, James has been such a help," Margaret said quickly, forcing a laugh. "I don't know how I'd manage without him." Emily's brow furrowed. "You've said that before, Mom. But it's not like you're incapable of managing things yourself. You've always been independent." Margaret faltered, her fingers gripping the edge of her napkin. "It's just nice to have company," she said softly. James remained silent, his focus fixed on his plate. The tension in the room was palpable, and Chloe, sensing something was off, quickly changed the subject. That night, Emily confronted James in the kitchen while he was rinsing dishes. "James, what's going on with you and Grandma?" she asked bluntly. James froze, the plate slipping slightly in his hands. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "You've been acting different," Emily said, crossing her arms. "And so has she. I can't put my finger on it, but something feels off." James took a deep breath, his mind racing. "We've just been spending a lot of time together," he said. "She's been lonely since Grandpa passed, and I'm just trying to be there for her." Emily studied him, her gaze sharp. "Are you sure that's all it is?" "Yes," James said firmly, meeting her eyes. "That's all it is." Emily hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay," she said. "But if something's going on, you'd tell me, right?" "Of course," James lied, his chest tight. The close call left James shaken, but it also made him more determined to protect his relationship with Margaret. The two of them agreed to be even more cautious, limiting their interactions and avoiding unnecessary conversations around the rest of the family. But secrecy came at a cost. The emotional toll of constantly hiding their feelings began to strain their bond. Margaret found herself retreating into solitude, questioning the choices she had made, while James wrestled with his own guilt and fear. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, Margaret broke the silence. "James, I'm starting to wonder if this was a mistake," she said softly, her voice trembling. James looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "This," Margaret said, gesturing between them. "What we have, it's not sustainable. It's tearing us apart." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Don't say that," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "We've come this far. We can't give up now." Margaret shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But at what cost? Look at what it's doing to us. To the family." James reached out, taking her hands in his. "I don't care about the cost," he said. "You mean everything to me, Grandma. I can't lose you." Margaret's resolve wavered, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. I don't want to lose you either, she whispered. But I'm scared, James. I'm so scared. James moved closer, his grip on her hands tightening. We'll figure it out, he said firmly. We'll get through this. Together. But as much as they tried to hold on to their connection, the world around them continued to close in. Emily's suspicions grew, fueled by the subtle shifts in their behavior. Mrs. Peterson's watchful eyes seemed to follow their every move. And David, though less perceptive, began to notice the tension within the family. One afternoon, Emily confronted Margaret directly. Mom, I need to ask you something, Emily said, her tone serious. Margaret set down her teacup, her heart racing. What is it, dear? It's about you and James, Emily said, her gaze unwavering. I feel like there's something you're not telling me. Something important. Margaret's throat tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. Emily, I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Emily insisted. I can see it in the way you two look at each other, the way you act when you're around him. It's not normal. Margaret's chest tightened, her mind scrambling for an explanation. James and I have grown close, yes, she said carefully. But it's because we're both grieving. We've been there for each other in a way no one else can understand. Emily frowned, her suspicion unabated. Are you sure that's all it is? Margaret met her daughter's gaze, forcing herself to stay composed. Yes, she said firmly. That's all it is. Emily left the conversation unsatisfied, but Margaret knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The carefully constructed mask they had worn for so long was beginning to crumble, and the cracks were becoming impossible to hide. As Margaret sat alone in the living room that night, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace, she couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. The world they had built for themselves was fragile, and it was only a matter of time before it shattered completely. The tension in the Carter household had reached its peak. Margaret and James's secret was no longer confined to stolen glances and whispered moments. It had become an invisible storm that threatened to tear the family apart. Emily's suspicions had grown too strong to ignore, and Margaret knew they were running out of time. It was a quiet Sunday morning when the breaking point arrived. Emily and David had come over for brunch, bringing Chloe along. Margaret had worked hard to prepare a perfect meal, hoping to maintain the illusion of normalcy. James helped her set the table, his movements tense and deliberate. As the family gathered in the dining room, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words. Emily's eyes flicked between Margaret and James, her suspicion evident. So, Mom, Emily began, her tone casual but pointed. How's everything been around here? Margaret smiled tightly. Everything's fine, dear. James has been a great help, as always. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. You've said that before. Almost like a script. James froze, his gaze dropping to his plate. Margaret shot Emily a warning look, but Emily pressed on. James, Emily said, her voice sharp. What's really going on here? James looked up, his expression guarded. Nothing's going on, Mom, he said evenly. Grandma and I are just close. Too close, Emily snapped, her voice rising. Don't think I haven't noticed the way you two act around each other. It's not normal. David frowned, glancing between Emily and Margaret. What are you talking about, Emily? I'm talking about this, Emily said, gesturing between Margaret and James. The secret looks, the awkward silences, the way they avoid talking about anything real. Something's going on, and I want the truth. Margaret's face paled, and she gripped the edge of the table. Emily, you're being ridiculous. Am I? Emily shot back. Then tell me why you've been acting so strange. Why James can't even look me in the eye anymore. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Stop it, Mom, he said, his voice trembling. You're blowing this out of proportion. Am I? Emily demanded, standing as well. Then tell me I'm wrong. Tell me nothing's going on. The room fell into a stunned silence, everyone's eyes on James. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his chest heaving with suppressed emotion. Emily, that's enough, Margaret said, her voice firm. You're making baseless accusations. Emily turned to her mother, her eyes blazing. Then prove me wrong, Mom. Because right now, all I see is a family falling apart because of lies. The confrontation hung in the air like a thunderstorm, crackling with tension. David finally spoke, his voice low and steady. Everyone sit down. We're going to talk about this calmly. Reluctantly, Emily and James sat, though the tension between them was palpable. Margaret remained standing, her hands shaking as she gripped the back of her chair. There's nothing to talk about, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Emily's just imagining things. Am I? Emily countered. Or are you just too afraid to admit the truth? James slammed his hand on the table, startling everyone. That's enough, he shouted. Leave her alone, Mom. She's been through enough already. Emily's eyes narrowed. And what about you, James? What have you been through that makes you act like this? I'm trying to help her, James snapped. She lost Grandpa and she's been lonely. I'm just trying to be there for her. But you've crossed a line, haven't you? Emily said coldly. You and Grandma. Whatever this is, it's not normal. Margaret's voice broke as she tried to intervene. Emily, please. No, Emily interrupted, her voice shaking. I want the truth. Right now. The room descended into chaos, voices overlapping as accusations and denials flew back and forth. Chloe sat frozen in her seat, her eyes wide with shock. David tried to mediate, but his attempts were drowned out by the rising volume. Finally, Margaret's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. Enough, she shouted, silencing everyone. Tears streamed down her face as she looked around the table, her expression filled with anguish. You're right, Emily, Margaret said, her voice trembling. Something has been going on. But it's not what you think. Emily's jaw tightened. Then tell me what it is. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flicking to James. He gave her a small nod, his own eyes filled with pain. It's complicated, Margaret said finally. James and our relationship has changed. We've grown closer because of the grief we've both felt. But it's not. It's not what you're accusing us of. Emily's face hardened. Then why does it feel like you're lying? Margaret's shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her hands. Because I'm ashamed, she admitted. Ashamed of how much I've come to rely on him. Ashamed that I've let my grief cloud my judgment. The room fell silent, the weight of Margaret's confession settling over the family. Emily's expression softened slightly, but the suspicion in her eyes remained. David finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. This family has been through enough, he said. We need to focus on healing, not tearing each other apart. Emily nodded reluctantly, though her gaze lingered on Margaret and James. Chloe finally found her voice, her tone hesitant. Can we just try to move forward? I don't want to lose this family. Margaret wiped her tears, her heart aching at the pain she had caused. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, she said softly. I just want us to be whole again. James nodded, his voice quiet. Me too. The confrontation marked a turning point for the Carter family. The cracks in their foundation had been exposed, and while the truth remained shrouded in half-admissions and evasions, it was clear that healing would require time, effort, and honesty. As Margaret and James sat together that evening, their bond now strained by the events of the day, they realized that the path forward would be anything but easy. But they also knew that, for better or worse, their connection had changed them forever. As the fallout from the confrontation settled, the cracks in the Carter family deepened. The revelation of the unspoken tension between Margaret and James left the family reeling, each member struggling to process the implications. The once strong bonds that held them together were now strained to the breaking point. The day after the explosive confrontation, the Carter household was eerily silent. Emily and David had left abruptly, taking Chloe with them, leaving Margaret and James alone to pick up the pieces. Margaret sat at the dining table, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. The events of the previous day played on a loop in her mind, each accusation and denial cutting deeper than the last. James entered the room quietly, his steps hesitant. "Grandma," he said softly, pulling out a chair across from her. "Are you okay?" Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and weary. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like everything's falling apart." James reached out, placing a comforting hand over hers. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "We just need to figure out what to do next." Margaret shook her head, her voice trembling. "I don't know if there's a way to fix this. Emily doesn't trust me anymore. She doesn't trust us." James's jaw tightened and he looked away. "She doesn't understand," he muttered. "She doesn't know what we've been through." "That's not her fault," Margaret said gently. "She's trying to protect her family, her children. And maybe she's right to be suspicious. We've crossed boundaries we shouldn't have." James frowned, his hands clenching into fists. "But we didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. "Not really. We've just been there for each other." Margaret hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "Maybe. But it doesn't feel that simple anymore." Later that day, Emily called Margaret, her voice cold and distant. "Mom, I need some time," Emily said bluntly. "I need to figure out how I feel about all of this." Margaret's heart sank, but she nodded, even though Emily couldn't see her. "I understand," she said quietly. "Take all the time you need." "And James?" Emily asked. "What's going to happen with him?" Margaret hesitated, her grip tightening on the phone. "He'll stay here for now," she said. "But I'll make sure we set some boundaries." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Boundaries? It's a little late for that, don't you think?" Margaret closed her eyes, the weight of Emily's words pressing down on her. "I'll do better," she promised. "I'll fix this." As days turned into weeks, the rift within the family grew. Emily and David avoided visiting Margaret's house, their calls becoming infrequent and strained. Chloe, once close to her grandmother, now seemed distant, her conversations with Margaret short and perfunctory. James too felt the strain. He spent most of his time at home, avoiding friends and social gatherings. The weight of their secret and the fallout from the confrontation left him isolated and unsure of his place in the world. One evening, as he sat in his room, scrolling aimlessly through his phone, Margaret knocked on the door. "Can I come in?" she asked softly. James nodded, setting his phone aside. Margaret entered, closing the door behind her. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. James frowned, his stomach knotting. "About what?" "About us," Margaret said. "And about what's happening to this family." James looked away, his jaw tightening. "It's not fair," he muttered. "They're blaming us for something we didn't do." "They're scared," Margaret said gently. "Scared of losing the family we've built. Scared of what they don't understand." James let out a bitter laugh. "And what about us? Don't we deserve to be happy too?" Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We do," she said. "But not at the expense of everything else. We have to find a way to move forward. To rebuild the trust we've lost." James looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "How do we do that?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders sagging. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we have to try." The Carter family, once bound by unshakable ties, now found itself fractured. The aftermath of the confrontation had left lingering wounds that no one seemed eager to heal. Margaret and James tried to navigate the storm in their own ways, but the distance between them and the rest of the family only widened. Emily sat in her living room, the remnants of dinner scattered on the coffee table. David was reading a book, but she could tell he wasn't truly focused. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved tension. "I can't stop thinking about Mom and James," Emily said suddenly, breaking the quiet. David lowered his book, looking at her with a furrowed brow. "What about them?" "About how close they've gotten," Emily said, her voice strained. "It's not normal. Something about it feels Wrong. David sighed, setting the book aside. Emily, you've been obsessing over this for weeks. Maybe you're reading too much into it. Emily shook her head, her hands clenching into fists. No, I'm not. You didn't see the way they looked at each other. The way they acted around each other. There's something they're not telling us. David leaned back, rubbing his temples. Even if there is, what can we do? They're adults. It's not our place to interfere. Emily stared at him, frustration flashing in her eyes. It is when it affects our family. When it affects Chloe. David looked at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Then what do you want to do? I don't know, Emily admitted, her voice cracking. But I can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine. Back at Margaret's house, the atmosphere was no less tense. James and Margaret had fallen into a fragile routine, avoiding conversations about the confrontation while trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But the strain of secrecy and the guilt that came with it weighed heavily on both of them. One afternoon, as James was fixing a loose shelf in the living room, Margaret entered, her expression hesitant. James, can we talk? She asked. James straightened, setting down his tools. Sure, he said, though his tone was wary. Margaret sat on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I've been thinking about what Emily said, she began. About how our relationship has affected the family. James frowned, his jaw tightening. She doesn't understand, he said. She's judging us without knowing the whole story. I know, Margaret said softly. But maybe she's right about one thing. Maybe we need to take a step back. For the sake of the family. James stared at her, his heart sinking. You're saying we should stop spending time together. I'm saying we need to be careful, Margaret said. If we don't, we could lose everything. James sat down beside her, his hands running through his hair. I don't want to lose you, Grandma, he said, his voice trembling. You're the only person who's ever truly understood me. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You won't lose me, she said firmly. But we need to find a way to rebuild trust with the rest of the family. They're hurting too, James. Emily, meanwhile, decided to confront Chloe about her thoughts on the situation. She found her daughter in her room, headphones on as she worked on a school project. Chloe, Emily said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Can we talk? Chloe pulled off her headphones, looking at her mother curiously. What's up? Emily hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. It's about Grandma and James, she said finally. Chloe's expression darkened. I don't want to talk about it. Why not? Emily pressed. Because it's weird, Chloe said bluntly. The way they act around each other. It makes me uncomfortable. Emily's heart sank. I feel the same way, she admitted. But I don't know how to fix it. Chloe shrugged, looking away. Maybe you can't. Maybe they just have to figure it out on their own. Emily frowned, her daughter's words echoing in her mind. I don't know if I can wait for that, she said softly. I'm scared of what might happen if we don't do something. Margaret and James's efforts to create distance between them were only partially successful. Their bond, forged in shared grief and understanding, was too strong to sever completely. But the weight of the family's judgment and the fear of discovery loomed over every interaction. One evening, as they sat together in the kitchen, James broke the silence. Do you ever regret it? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret looked at him, her brow furrowing. Regret what? Everything, James said. The way we've changed things. Margaret's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. I don't regret caring for you, she said softly. I don't regret the connection we have. But I do regret the pain it's caused. James nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the table. I just want things to go back to the way they were. Margaret reached out, placing a hand over his. So do I, she said. But we can't change the past. All we can do is try to move forward. The division within the Carter family deepened as Margaret and James struggled to find a way forward. The bonds that had once held them together now felt like fragile threads, fraying under the weight of suspicion and unspoken truths. The path to healing seemed distant, but Margaret and James knew they had to try. For the sake of the family they had nearly lost. The rift in the Carter family seemed to widen with each passing day. Margaret and James, once inseparable in their shared grief, now found themselves drifting apart under the weight of guilt and judgment. Emily and David remained distant, their calls infrequent and strained. Chloe, too, had retreated, unsure of how to navigate the unspoken tension within the family. One afternoon, Margaret sat in her living room, the silence oppressive. The faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall reminded her of the time slipping away, time she had once cherished with her family. She thought back to the days when laughter filled the house, when Sunday dinners brought everyone together. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. James stepped inside, his expression tired. He had taken to going on long walks, a way to clear his mind and escape the suffocating atmosphere of the house. "Hey," he said softly, setting his keys on the table. "Hi," Margaret replied, her voice equally quiet. James hesitated before sitting down across from her. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his brow furrowing. "Are you okay?" Margaret offered a small, strained smile. "I've just been thinking about everything." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Me too. Feels like we're losing them, Grandma. Like we're losing everything." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy. "No. And I don't know how to fix it." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe we need to talk to them. To Mom and Dad. Try to explain." Margaret's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. "James, we can't. If we tell them—" "I'm not saying we tell them everything," James interrupted. "But we can't keep pretending like nothing's wrong. It's tearing us apart." The idea of confronting Emily and David terrified Margaret, but she knew James was right. The distance between them had become unbearable, and the only way to bridge the gap was to face the truth, at least part of it. That evening, Margaret called Emily. "Hi, Mom," Emily answered, her tone cautious. "Hi, dear," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "I was wondering if you and David could come over for dinner. I think we need to talk." Emily hesitated before replying. "'Kay. When?" "Tomorrow night," Margaret said. "If you're free." "We'll be there," Emily said, her voice unreadable. The next evening, the tension in the house was palpable as Margaret and James prepared for Emily and David's arrival. Margaret fussed over the table settings, her hands shaking as she adjusted the silverware for the third time. "Relax, Grandma," James said gently. "It's just dinner." Margaret gave him a weak smile. "It's not just dinner, James. This could change everything." When Emily and David arrived, the atmosphere was strained but polite. They exchanged pleasantries as they sat down at the table, the weight of unspoken words hanging over them. The meal began quietly, the clinking of silverware the only sound. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "Mom, you said you wanted to talk," she said, her tone direct. "What's going on?" Margaret set down her fork, her hands trembling. "Hey. I know things have been difficult lately," she began. "And I know I haven't made it easy for any of you." Emily's gaze was sharp, her arms crossed. "That's an understatement." "Emily," David said softly, placing a hand on her arm. Margaret swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I've been struggling. Since Robert passed, I've felt lost. And James has been my anchor. He's been there for me in ways I never expected." Emily's brow furrowed. "We know that, Mom. But it's more than that, isn't it?" Margaret hesitated, glancing at James. He gave her a small nod, encouraging her to continue. "We've grown closer," Margaret admitted. "Closer than we should have. But it's because we've both been grieving. And I know it's made you uncomfortable, Emily, but I promise you, it's not what you think." Emily's expression hardened. "How am I supposed to believe that?" James spoke up, his voice steady. "Because it's the truth, Mom. I've been helping Grandma because I love her, and I don't want her to feel alone. That's all." Emily looked between them, her eyes narrowing. Then why does it feel like you're hiding something? The tension in the room was suffocating. Margaret's heart raced as she searched for the right words, but none came. Finally, David broke the silence. "Emily," he said gently, "maybe we need to give them the benefit of the doubt. We don't know what they've been through." Emily turned to her husband, her frustration evident. "But what if we're wrong? What if there's more to this than they're saying?" Margaret's voice broke as she interjected. "Emily, please. I know I've made mistakes, but I'm begging you. Don't let this tear our family apart." Emily stared at her mother, her expression conflicted. Finally, she let out a sigh, her shoulders slumping. "I don't know if I can trust you, Mom. But for Chloe's sake, I'll try." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's all I can ask." The dinner ended on a tentative note, the fractures in the family still visible but not as deep. Margaret and James knew they had a long road ahead, but for the first time there was a glimmer of hope. The tentative peace forged at dinner was fragile, like a thread stretched too thin. Emily's agreement to try and mend the rift didn't come with forgiveness or understanding. Margaret and James felt the weight of her doubt, and every interaction was charged with tension. Yet it was a step forward, however unsteady. The next day, Margaret found herself standing in her kitchen, staring blankly out the window. The garden she once tended with care had grown wild, a reflection of the chaos in her life. She felt James's presence before she saw him. He entered the room quietly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile calm. "How are you feeling?" James asked softly, taking a seat at the table. Margaret turned to him, offering a faint smile. "Exhausted," she admitted, "but hopeful. Last night wasn't perfect, but it was a start." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think Mom really meant it? That she'll try?" Margaret sighed, sitting down across from him. "I think she wants to, for Chloe's sake if nothing else. But it's going to take time. We have to be patient." James looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "I hate feeling like this," he said quietly. "Like we're constantly being judged." Margaret reached out, placing her hand over his. "I know," she said gently. "But we have to focus on what matters. Keeping this family together." Emily, too, was grappling with the aftermath of the dinner. She sat with David in their living room, her arms crossed as she stared at the flickering television. "I don't know if I believe them," Emily admitted, her voice heavy with doubt. "But I don't want to lose them either." David placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's not about believing them," he said. "Maybe it's about giving them the chance to prove themselves." Emily frowned, her brow furrowing. "And what if they're lying? What if this is just another cover-up?" "Then we'll deal with it," David said simply. "But for now we have to trust that they're telling the truth. It's the only way forward." Over the next few weeks, the family made cautious efforts to rebuild their connections. Emily started calling Margaret more often, though their conversations remained polite and surface level. Chloe began visiting her grandmother again, her initial discomfort fading as Margaret focused on making her feel at home. James, however, struggled to navigate the shifting dynamics. He felt caught between his loyalty to Margaret and his desire to prove to Emily that their bond was innocent. The pressure weighed heavily on him, and he found himself withdrawing from both his family and his friends. One evening, as Margaret and James sat in the living room, she noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. "You've been so quiet lately," Margaret said softly. "What's on your mind?" James hesitated before replying. "I just feel stuck," he admitted. "No matter what we do, it feels like we're walking on eggshells." Margaret's heart ached at his words. "I'm sorry, James. I never wanted this for you." "It's not your fault," James said quickly. "I made my choices too." Margaret nodded, her gaze distant. "We both did. And now we have to live with them." Despite the tension, there were moments of hope. One Sunday afternoon, Emily invited Margaret and James over for lunch. It was the first time the family had gathered under one roof since the confrontation, and the atmosphere was tentative but not hostile. As they sat around the dining table, Chloe shared stories about school, her laughter filling the room. David cracked a few jokes, his dry humor eliciting small smiles from everyone. Even Emily seemed to relax, though her watchful gaze occasionally lingered on Margaret and James. "Chloe, you've grown so much," Margaret said, her tone warm. "I can't believe how quickly time is passing." "Tell me about it," Emily said, her voice lighter than usual. "It feels like just yesterday she was running around in pigtails." The moment felt almost normal, and for the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to hope that they could find their way back to each other. However, the underlying tension remained. After lunch, as Margaret and James prepared to leave, Emily pulled her mother aside. "Mom," Emily said quietly, her expression serious. "I appreciate you making an effort. But I'm still watching." Margaret's heart sank, but she nodded. "I understand," she said softly. "I just want to make things right." Emily studied her for a moment before nodding. "Then keep doing what you're doing. Maybe with time we can move past this." Margaret offered a faint smile. "That's all I want." As they drove home, James glanced at Margaret. "How did it go?" he asked. Margaret hesitated before replying. "Better than I expected," she said. "But we still have a long way to go." James nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll get there," he said firmly. "We have to." The fragile reconciliation within the Carter family was far from complete, but it was a step in the right direction. Margaret and James knew that their journey would be fraught with challenges, but they were determined to rebuild the trust they had lost, even if it meant confronting their own mistakes along the way. Despite the tentative steps toward reconciliation, the tension within the Carter family lingered like a shadow, casting doubt on every interaction. Margaret and James felt the strain in every conversation, every glance. The family may have been coming together on the surface, but beneath it all, unresolved questions and suspicions threatened to tear them apart once again. Margaret spent her mornings tending to the garden, seeking solace in the familiar rhythm of pruning and planting. It was her way of coping, a small measure of control in a life that felt increasingly chaotic. But even the serenity of her garden couldn't quiet the unease in her heart. One morning, as she knelt by the rose bushes, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Emily standing at the gate, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "Good morning," Margaret said cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron. "Morning," Emily replied, stepping closer. "I thought I'd stop by. See how you're doing." Margaret forced a smile. "That's kind of you." "I'm doing well considering." Emily nodded, but her gaze lingered on her mother, sharp and searching. "You seem tired," she said. "Is everything okay?" Margaret hesitated, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "It's just been a lot lately," she admitted. "Trying to rebuild trust to make things right. It's exhausting." Emily's eyes softened slightly, but the tension between them remained. "I know it's not easy," she said. "But I need to be able to trust you, Mom. And right now I don't know if I can." Margaret's heart ached at her daughter's words. "I'm trying, Emily," she said quietly. "I really am." Meanwhile, James was grappling with his own doubts. The weight of the family's judgment, coupled with his growing guilt, had left him feeling isolated and unsure of his place. He avoided Emily and David whenever possible, retreating to his room or taking long drives to clear his mind. One evening, as he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, Margaret knocked on the door. "Come in," James said, his voice tired. Margaret entered, closing the door behind her. She sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been so quiet lately," she said gently. "What's on your mind?" James let out a heavy sigh. "Everything," he admitted. "I feel like no matter what we do, it's never going to be enough. They're always going to see us as the problem." Margaret reached out, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's going to take time," she said softly. "Trust isn't rebuilt overnight." James looked at her, his expression conflicted. "Do you think they'll ever really forgive us?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But we have to keep trying." For the sake of the family. Despite their efforts, Emily's doubts continued to fester. She found herself analyzing every interaction between Margaret and James, searching for clues that might confirm her suspicions. Her unease began to affect her relationship with David, who grew frustrated with her relentless focus on the situation. "Emily, you're obsessing," David said one evening as they sat in their living room. "You need to let it go." "I can't," Emily replied, her voice sharp. "Not until I know the truth." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What truth, Emily? They've already told us what's going on. Maybe it's time to believe them." Emily shook her head, her jaw tightening. "There's more to this, David. I can feel it." "And what if you're wrong?" David asked. "What if all you're doing is driving a wedge further into this family?" Emily's resolve wavered, but only for a moment. "If I'm wrong, then I'll apologize," she said. "But I need to be sure." The tension came to a head during a family dinner hosted at Emily and David's house. Margaret and James arrived together, their demeanor subdued. Emily greeted them politely but kept her distance, her watchful gaze never straying far. As they sat around the table, Chloe tried to lighten the mood with stories about her friends and school projects. But the conversation felt forced, and the underlying tension was impossible to ignore. At one point, Emily turned to James, her tone sharp. "So, James, how have you been spending your time lately?" James stiffened, his gaze dropping to his plate. "Just helping Grandma around the house," he said evenly. "That's all?" Emily pressed. James looked up, his jaw tightening. "What are you trying to say, Mom?" "I'm just asking a question," Emily said, her tone defensive. "You've been awfully quiet lately. I'm just wondering why." Margaret intervened, her voice steady but firm. "Emily, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Mom?" Emily shot back. "We keep dancing around this, pretending everything's fine, but it's not." David placed a hand on Emily's arm, his voice calm but firm. "Emily, that's enough." Emily glanced at him, her frustration evident, but she didn't push further. The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, each family member lost in their own thoughts. That evening, as Margaret and James drove home, the weight of Emily's words hung heavy between them. "She doesn't trust us," James said quietly, staring out the window. Margaret gripped the steering wheel, her heart aching. "I know," she said softly. "But we have to give her time." James nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "I just hope it's enough." The lingering doubts within the Carter family continued to create cracks in their fragile reconciliation. Margaret and James knew they had a long road ahead, and the question of whether their bond could withstand the strain remained unanswered. As the Carter family tried to navigate their way back to normalcy, the weight of unresolved tension continued to pull them apart. The reconciliation was proving to be more fragile than anyone had anticipated, and every interaction seemed to chip away at the tenuous peace they had managed to establish. Margaret spent her days walking on eggshells, carefully choosing her words and actions around Emily and David. She tried to focus on the mundane tasks of daily life, cooking, cleaning, and tending to the garden, but the strain was ever present. She could feel the judgment in Emily's gaze, the doubt in every question, and the growing distance between her and the rest of the family. One afternoon, as Margaret stood at the sink washing dishes, she heard a knock at the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened it to find Emily standing on the porch, her expression guarded. "Emily," Margaret said, forcing a smile. "This is a surprise." "Can we talk?" Emily asked, her tone clipped. Margaret stepped aside to let her in, her heart sinking. She could sense that this conversation wouldn't be an easy one. They sat at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy. Emily folded her hands on the table, her gaze fixed on her mother. "Mom," Emily began, her voice steady but strained. "I've been trying to move past everything to trust you again, but it's hard." Margaret nodded, her chest tightening. "I understand," she said softly. "And I'm doing everything I can to make things right." Emily frowned, her eyes narrowing. "Are you? Because it still feels like you're hiding something." Margaret's breath hitched, but she kept her composure. "Emily, I've told you everything. There's nothing more to hide." Emily leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "Then why do I still feel like something isn't right?" Meanwhile, James was grappling with his own struggles. The strain of maintaining the facade was wearing on him, and he found himself withdrawing more and more. He avoided his friends, spent hours alone in his room, and rarely ventured out of the house unless absolutely necessary. One evening, as he sat on the porch staring at the fading sunset, Margaret joined him. She carried 2 mugs of tea, setting one down beside him before taking a seat. "You've been quiet," Margaret said gently, breaking the silence. James shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Just tired," he said. Margaret studied him, her heart aching at the exhaustion in his voice. "I know this hasn't been easy," she said. "For either of us." James let out a bitter laugh. "That's an understatement." Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "We'll get through this," she said. "We just need to stay strong." James turned to her, his eyes filled with doubt. "What if we can't? What if we've already lost them?" Margaret's chest tightened, but she forced herself to remain optimistic. "We haven't lost them yet," she said firmly. "And as long as we keep trying, there's still hope." The cracks in their relationship with Emily and David became more evident during a family dinner the following weekend. Margaret had invited them over, hoping to rebuild their connection, but the evening quickly took a turn. As they sat around the table, the conversation turned to James's future. "So James," David said, his tone casual, "have you thought about what's next for you? College? A job?" James stiffened, his gaze dropping to his plate. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "I've been focusing on helping Grandma." Emily frowned, her eyes narrowing. "You've been spending a lot of time with her," she said pointedly. James glanced at Margaret, his expression guarded. "She needs the help," he said simply. Emily leaned forward, her tone sharp. "And what about what you need? What about your own life?" James's jaw tightened, and he set his fork down with a clatter. "I'm doing what I think is right," he said evenly. "Is that a problem?" Emily's eyes flashed with frustration. "It is when it feels like you're using it as an excuse to avoid reality." "Emily," Margaret interjected, her voice steady but firm. "That's enough." Emily turned to her mother, her expression incredulous. "Why are you defending him? He's wasting his potential, and you're enabling him." Margaret's heart sank, and she took a deep breath. "James is doing what he thinks is best for now. We're all just trying to figure things out." Emily shook her head, her frustration evident. "You're both stuck in the past, and it's dragging all of us down." The tension at the table was palpable, and the rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence. After Emily and David left, James turned to Margaret, his expression filled with anger and hurt. "Why do we keep doing this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why do we keep trying when all they do is tear us down?" Margaret reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Because they're our family," she said softly. "And we can't give up on them." James shook his head, his jaw clenched. "Maybe they've already given up on us." The cracks in the Carter family were becoming impossible to ignore. Margaret and James were doing everything they could to hold on, but the weight of suspicion and judgment threatened to shatter what little progress they had made. The question of whether they could ever truly heal loomed over them, a shadow that refused to lift. The fragile piece that Margaret and James had been clinging to was beginning to unravel. Each conversation with Emily seemed to bring them closer to another confrontation, and James's growing frustration was becoming harder to contain. The family's attempts to move forward felt more like walking in circles, and the tension was building to a breaking point. Margaret sat in her living room, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on her. She stared at the photo of Robert on the mantel, his kind eyes and warm smile a stark contrast to the turmoil she felt inside. She whispered softly, "I don't know what to do anymore." The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts. James entered, his face set in a grim expression. He tossed his keys on the counter and sat down heavily on the couch. "Grandma, I can't keep doing this," James said, his voice low but filled with anger. Margaret frowned, leaning forward. "What happened?" "I ran into Mom at the store," James said, his hands gripping the edge of his knees. "She barely even looked at me, and when she did, it was like she hated me." Margaret's heart sank, and she reached out to place a comforting hand on his arm. "James, she doesn't hate you. She's just struggling. She doesn't trust us," James said bitterly. "No matter what we do, she's never going to let this go." Margaret sighed, her own frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "I know it feels that way, but we can't give up. She's your mother, and I'm her mother. We have to find a way to fix this." James shook his head, his jaw tightening. "What if we can't?" Later that evening, Margaret decided to call Emily, hoping to ease the tension between them. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. After a few rings, Emily answered. "Mom," Emily said, her tone cold. "What is it?" Margaret hesitated, her heart pounding. "Emily, I think we need to talk." "We've already talked," Emily replied sharply. "What else is there to say?" "I know you're still upset," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "But we can't keep going on like this. We need to find a way to move forward." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Move forward? Mom, I don't even know where we stand. How am I supposed to trust you when you won't even be honest with me?" Margaret's chest tightened, and she struggled to find the right words. "I'm being honest, Emily. I've told you everything." "No, you haven't," Emily said, her voice rising. "There's still something you're hiding, and until you tell me the truth, I don't see how we can move forward." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "I'm trying, Emily. I'm trying." Emily sighed, her voice softening slightly. "Then try harder." The conversation left Margaret shaken, and she sat in the kitchen long after the call ended, her mind racing. James found her there, staring blankly at the table. "Grandma," he said softly, his brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" Margaret looked up at him, her eyes glistening with tears. "I don't know how much more of this I can take," she admitted. "Emily doesn't trust me. She doesn't trust us. And I don't know how to fix it." James knelt beside her, his expression filled with determination. "We'll figure it out," he said firmly. "No matter what it takes." Margaret placed a hand on his cheek, her voice trembling. "I just want my family back." The tension came to a head during a family gathering at Emily's house. It was meant to be a casual barbecue, a chance for the family to reconnect, but the undercurrent of mistrust made it anything but. As they sat around the patio table, Emily's questions grew sharper, her tone more accusatory. James's patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. "Why can't you just let this go?" James demanded, standing abruptly. "Why do you keep treating us like criminals?" Emily stood as well, her eyes blazing. "Because you're hiding something, James. And until you come clean, I can't trust you. We've told you everything." James shouted, his voice filled with frustration. "Why isn't that enough?" "Because it doesn't make sense," Emily shot back. "None of this makes sense." Margaret stood as well, her voice trembling as she tried to intervene. "Emily, please. We're doing the best we can." Emily turned to her, her expression filled with pain and anger. "Then why does it feel like you're lying?" The confrontation left the family in chaos, and the fragile peace they had tried to build was shattered. Margaret and James left the gathering feeling more isolated than ever, their connection to the family hanging by a thread. That night, as they sat together in the living room, Margaret and James faced the reality of their situation. "I don't know if we can fix this," Margaret said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. James reached for her hand, his grip firm. "We have to try," he said. "We can't give up." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy. "We'll try," she said softly. "But I don't know if it will be enough." The cracks in the Carter family had deepened, leaving Margaret and James to wonder if they could ever truly repair the damage. The road ahead seemed impossibly long, but they resolved to keep fighting, for themselves, and for the family they still hoped to save. The Carter family was at a crossroads. The tension from the confrontation at Emily's barbecue had left deep scars, and the once fragile hope for reconciliation now seemed like an impossible dream. Margaret and James found themselves grappling with a painful question. Was there a path to healing, or had their family already been irreparably torn apart? Margaret spent the morning pacing the living room, her mind racing. The memory of Emily's harsh words lingered, cutting deeper than she wanted to admit. She knew the family couldn't continue like this, but every attempt at resolution seemed to drive them further apart. She picked up the phone and dialed David's number. He answered after a few rings, his voice cautious. "Margaret, is everything okay?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "David, I need to talk to you. Alone." There was a pause before he replied. "'Kay. When?" "Today," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "If you can." David sighed. "I'll come by this afternoon." That afternoon, Margaret and David sat in the kitchen, the tension between them palpable. David had always been the steady presence in the family, the one who could calm Emily when her temper flared. But even he seemed weary now, his patience worn thin. "David," Margaret began, her hands clasped tightly on the table. "I need your help." David raised an eyebrow. "With what?" "With Emily," Margaret said. "She's holding on to so much anger, so much mistrust. I don't know how to reach her." David leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Mom, you have to understand. Emily feels betrayed. She feels like you and James have shut her out, like you're keeping something from her." Margaret looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. "I'm not keeping anything from her. At least, not in the way she thinks." David frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on her. "Mean, I've made mistakes. I've leaned on James more than I should have. But it's not what Emily thinks. Just grief, loneliness. And I don't know how to explain that to her." David studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Maybe you don't need to explain it to her. Maybe you just need to show her." Margaret frowned. "Show her how?" "By being honest," David said. "By letting her see that you're human, that you're struggling too. She's angry because she feels like you're shutting her out. If you want her to trust you again, you have to let her in." While Margaret and David talked, James was grappling with his own frustrations. He had taken to spending long hours at the park, seeking solace in the open air. But even the peaceful surroundings couldn't quiet the storm inside him. That evening, as he sat on a bench watching the sunset, his phone buzzed. 'Twas Chloe. "Hey, James," Chloe said when he answered, her voice hesitant. "Can we talk?" James frowned. "Course. What's up?" I don't know what's going on with you and Grandma," Chloe said. "But I miss the way things used to be. I miss us being a family." James's chest tightened and he let out a heavy sigh. "I miss it too," he admitted. "But things are complicated right now." Chloe was silent for a moment before asking, "Do you think we'll ever get back to normal?" James hesitated, his heart aching at the hope in her voice. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I hope so." The next day, David called Emily and asked her to come over to Margaret's house. She agreed reluctantly, her tone guarded. When she arrived, she found Margaret waiting for her on the porch, her expression nervous but determined. "Emily," Margaret said softly, "can we talk?" Emily crossed her arms, her gaze wary. "What is it now, Mom?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I want to apologize. For everything. For the way I've hurt you, for the way I've let my grief affect our family. I've made mistakes and I'm sorry." Emily's expression softened slightly, but the mistrust in her eyes remained. "Why now?" she asked. "Why are you saying this now?" "Because I don't want to lose you," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "You're my daughter and I love you. I know I haven't shown it the way I should, but I do." Emily looked away, her arms tightening around herself. "It's not just about me, Mom. It's about James too. I don't know if I can trust either of you." Margaret stepped closer, her voice filled with emotion. Then let us earn your trust. Let us prove to you that we're trying to make things right. Emily didn't respond immediately, but later that evening she called Margaret. I'm willing to try, Emily said, her voice cautious. But it's going to take time. Margaret closed her eyes, relief washing over her. That's all I'm asking for. The tentative progress gave the family a glimmer of hope, but the path to healing was still fraught with challenges. Margaret and James knew they would have to work tirelessly to rebuild the trust they had lost, but for the first time in weeks, the possibility of resolution felt within reach. The tentative truce within the Carter family brought a fragile sense of relief. Emily's decision to try again opened the door to reconciliation, but the process of rebuilding trust was fraught with challenges. Margaret and James knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. They had to demonstrate their sincerity through actions. Margaret spent the morning preparing for Emily's next visit, meticulously arranging the living room and baking Emily's favorite cookies. A small gesture, but one she hoped would convey her commitment to making amends. As she placed the cookies on a tray, she heard James's footsteps behind her. Are you nervous? James asked, leaning against the kitchen counter. Margaret smiled faintly. A little, she admitted. But this is a step forward. I have to believe that. James nodded, though his expression remained troubled. What if it doesn't work? What if she still doesn't trust us? Margaret reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. Then we keep trying, she said firmly. We don't give up. When Emily arrived later that afternoon, the tension in the room was palpable. She greeted her mother with a cautious smile and gave James a brief nod, but her guarded demeanor made it clear that her trust was still fragile. Margaret gestured to the couch. Come, sit down. I made your favorite cookies. Emily hesitated before sitting, her eyes scanning the room. Thanks, Mom, she said, her tone polite but distant. Margaret sat across from her, her hands folded in her lap. I know things have been difficult, she began. And I know I have a lot to make up for. But I want you to know that I'm committed to fixing this. To fixing us. Emily nodded slowly. I appreciate that, Mom. But it's going to take time. I understand, Margaret said. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes. The conversation gradually shifted to lighter topics. Emily's work, Chloe's school projects, and the family's shared memories. For the first time in weeks, the atmosphere felt almost normal. But beneath the surface, the weight of unspoken words still lingered. As the afternoon wore on, James joined the conversation, his tone careful but genuine. He spoke about his plans to look into college programs and how he wanted to start focusing on his future. Emily listened attentively, her expression softening as James spoke. That's good, James, Emily said. It's important to think about what's next. James nodded, his gaze steady. I know I've been distracted lately, but I'm trying to move forward. To do better. Emily studied him for a moment before offering a small smile. That's all I want for you. After Emily left, Margaret and James sat together in the living room, the tension in their shoulders slowly easing. That went better than I expected, James said, a hint of relief in his voice. Margaret nodded, her smile faint but genuine. It's a start, she said. And that's more than we've had in a long time. Despite the progress, the road to reconciliation was still far from smooth. Emily's doubts lingered, and every interaction felt like a delicate balancing act. Margaret and James walked a fine line, careful not to overstep or say the wrong thing. One evening, as Emily and David hosted a family dinner, Margaret found herself sitting beside Chloe. The young girl's usual liveliness had been tempered by the recent tensions, and Margaret couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. How have you been, Chloe? Margaret asked gently. Chloe shrugged, poking at her food with her fork. Okay, I guess. Margaret reached out, placing a hand on Chloe's shoulder. I know things have been difficult lately, but I want you to know how much I love you. And how much I've missed you. Chloe looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of emotions. I miss the way things used to be, she said softly. Margaret's heart ached, and she pulled Chloe into a gentle hug. So do I, sweetheart, she said. And I'm going to do everything I can to make things better. As the weeks passed, the family began to find small moments of connection. Margaret and James continued to make efforts to rebuild trust, while Emily gradually allowed herself to lower her guard. The process was slow, and the scars from the past lingered, but there was a sense of cautious hope. One evening, as Emily sat with David on their porch, she reflected on the progress they had made. "It's not perfect," Emily said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "But it's better." David nodded, placing a comforting hand on her arm. "That's all we can ask for." The Carter family still had a long way to go, but the foundation for healing had been laid. Margaret and James knew that the road ahead would be challenging, but they were determined to face it together, for the sake of the family they loved. The Carter family was finally making strides toward understanding, but the road was far from smooth. With each step forward, old wounds threatened to resurface. Margaret and James were doing their best to honor Emily's request for transparency, but the weight of their choices still loomed large. The tension between mother and daughter was palpable, yet for the first time in months, there was a shared willingness to rebuild. One sunny Saturday morning, Emily invited Margaret, James, and Chloe over for breakfast. It was a cautious gesture, but one that spoke of her effort to move forward. Margaret arrived early, carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins, her nervous energy palpable. "Mom," Emily greeted her at the door, her tone warmer than it had been in weeks. "Thanks for coming." Margaret offered a small smile. "Thank you for inviting me. Means a lot." As the family sat around the table, the atmosphere was noticeably lighter. Chloe cracked a few jokes, drawing laughter from James, and even Emily managed a smile. Margaret watched her family interact, a sense of relief washing over her. For a moment, it felt like old times, before the secrets, the accusations, and the fractures. But as the meal wore on, the inevitable tensions began to surface. Emily's questions grew sharper, her tone more probing. "James," she said, setting down her coffee cup, "what are your plans moving forward? You can't spend your whole life helping Grandma." James stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I know, Mom. I've been thinking about going back to school." Emily's brow furrowed. "Thinking isn't doing, James. You need a plan." Margaret stepped in, her tone gentle but firm. "Emily, he's taking things one step at a time. Let's not rush him." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, but she nodded. "Fine. But he needs to start making decisions." Later, as Margaret helped Emily clean up in the kitchen, she decided to broach a delicate subject. "Emily," Margaret began, rinsing a plate under the faucet, "I know you're trying and I appreciate it more than I can say. But I feel like there's still so much we haven't talked about." Emily dried her hands on a towel, her expression guarded. "Like what?" Margaret hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Like the mistrust between us. I know I've made mistakes, but I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Emily leaned against the counter, her arms crossed. "It's not just about what you've done, Mom. It's about what you haven't done. You've been keeping things from me for so long, and I don't know how to move past that." Margaret's shoulders sagged, and she looked down at the plate in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this, Emily. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Emily studied her mother for a long moment before speaking. "I don't want to lose you, Mom. But I need time. And I need you to be honest with me." Margaret nodded, her heart heavy. "I can do that. I promise." Meanwhile, James was sitting with Chloe in the living room, their conversation surprisingly light-hearted. "You're finally going back to school?" Chloe asked, raising an eyebrow. "That's a big deal." James chuckled, leaning back on the couch. "Don't sound so surprised. I do have ambitions, you know." Chloe smirked. "Could have fooled me. But seriously, I think it's great. You deserve to figure out what you want." James smiled, appreciating her support. "Thanks, Chloe. That means a lot." Their conversation shifted to childhood memories, and for a brief moment, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift. James realized how much he missed these simple moments with his sister, moments of connection that had been overshadowed by the family's turmoil. As the day wore on, the family began to settle into a new rhythm. There were still unspoken tensions, but the willingness to rebuild was evident. Margaret and Emily's relationship remained fragile, but they were both committed to taking small steps toward trust. That evening, as Margaret and James drove home, they reflected on the day's events. "I think we're finally making progress," Margaret said, her voice tinged with hope. James nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's not perfect, but it's better than it's been in a long time." Margaret reached over, placing a hand on his arm. "Thank you, James, for everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." James smiled, his expression warm. "You're welcome, Grandma. We'll get through this together." The Carter family's journey was far from over, but they had taken an important step toward healing. The fractures in their relationships might never fully disappear, but the shared commitment to repair what had been broken gave them hope for the future. The tension that had defined the Carter family began to lift, though the scars left behind were still raw. Margaret knew that if she and James were ever to regain the family's trust, they had to confront their actions honestly and without excuses. Margaret sat in her living room, the photo album of her late husband, Robert, open on her lap. Each photograph felt like a reminder of the stability she had lost, a stability she had unintentionally jeopardized. James entered quietly, sitting beside her. "What are you looking at?" James asked, leaning closer. "Your grandfather," Margaret said softly, running her fingers over the faded images. "He would have known what to do. He always had a way of holding this family together." James sighed, his gaze drifting to the window. "I wish I could have known him better. Maybe things would be different." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late for us, James. We've made mistakes, but we can learn from them. We can fix this." James looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "Do you really believe that?" "I have to," Margaret said firmly. "Because if we don't try, we'll lose everything." Margaret decided to gather the family for a meeting, a chance to lay everything on the table. She called Emily and David, asking them to come over the next evening. The hesitation in Emily's voice was evident, but she agreed. The following evening, the family sat in the living room, the air thick with unspoken tension. Chloe, who had been quiet throughout much of the family's turmoil, sat on the couch, her gaze darting between her parents and grandparents. Margaret took a deep breath before speaking. "I've asked you all here because I owe you an explanation. And an apology." Emily's arms were crossed, her expression guarded. "We've heard apologies before, Mom. What's different this time?" Margaret looked at her daughter, tears brimming in her eyes. "This time I want to tell you the whole truth. No more half measures." Margaret recounted the loneliness she had felt after Robert's passing, the deep void that had consumed her. She explained how James had stepped in to fill that void, providing her with comfort and companionship in a way she hadn't expected. "I leaned on him too much," Margaret admitted. "And in doing so, I crossed boundaries I shouldn't have. But it was never meant to hurt anyone. It was grief. And I handled it poorly." James spoke next, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I was just trying to help Grandma. I didn't realize how it might look to everyone else. And for that I'm sorry." Emily listened, her expression softening slightly. "I believe you," she said finally. "But believing you doesn't erase what's happened. It doesn't make everything okay." "I don't expect it to," Margaret said. "I just want a chance to make things right. To prove to you that we can rebuild this family." David nodded, his voice calm but firm. "It's going to take time. But if you're willing to put in the effort, so are we." As the Carter family stepped into the daunting realm of addressing their fractured relationships, the reality of their collective pain became clearer. Margaret and James were caught in a web of choices that had far-reaching consequences, while Emily and David struggled to rebuild trust. Each member faced their own battles, but the fallout was a shared burden. Margaret found herself standing in her kitchen one afternoon, staring at a blank notebook. The page was intended to hold her thoughts and reflections, but her mind remained a tangled mess. She longed for clarity, for a way to articulate the weight of her decisions and their consequences. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She opened it to find Emily, her expression hesitant but determined. "Mom," Emily began, stepping inside, "I think we need to talk again." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. "Course. Let's sit." They settled at the kitchen table, the same spot where so many tense conversations had taken place. This time, however, the energy was different, less accusatory, more open. "I've been thinking," Emily said, her voice steady, "about everything. And I realized that I can't keep holding on to this anger. It's not helping anyone." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Emily, But," Emily interrupted gently, "that doesn't mean I'm ready to let it go completely. Trust doesn't just come back overnight." "I understand," Margaret said softly. "And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it back." Emily hesitated, her gaze dropping to the table. "Then let's start small. Be honest with me. Completely honest." Margaret took a deep breath, her chest tightening. "You will ask me anything." Meanwhile, James was grappling with his own fallout. He had started therapy at Margaret's urging, hoping to untangle the complex emotions he carried. His sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront truths he had buried deep within himself. "I feel like I've lost my place in the family," James admitted during one session. "Like I don't belong anymore." His therapist, a kind woman with sharp yet compassionate eyes, leaned forward. "Why do you feel that way?" "Because of everything that's happened," James said. "I've made choices that hurt people I love. And now, I don't know how to fix it." The therapist nodded thoughtfully. "Healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means learning from it and finding a way to move forward. Have you started having those conversations with your family?" James shook his head. "Not really. It feels too hard." "It will be hard," the therapist said gently. "But avoiding it will only make the distance between you grow." That evening, James returned home to find Margaret sitting on the couch, her notebook now filled with scribbled thoughts. She looked up as he entered, offering a small smile. "How was therapy?" she asked. "Hard," James admitted, dropping onto the couch beside her. "But I think it's helping." Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I've been doing some reflecting too. Emily and I talked earlier and it feels like there's a tiny bit of hope." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, she's willing to try," Margaret said. "But we have to meet her halfway." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "No. I just don't know if I'm ready." Margaret placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You'll never feel completely ready, James. But sometimes, taking the first step is all it takes." The first step came the following weekend when Emily invited Margaret and James over for dinner. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, and for the first time in months, it felt like a genuine attempt at reconciliation. As they sat around the table, Emily turned to James, her expression guarded but curious. "How have you been?" James hesitated, unsure of how much to share. Finally he said, "I've been going to therapy, trying to figure things out." Emily's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Therapy?" James nodded. It's been hard, but I think it's helping." Emily considered his words before nodding. "That's good, James. I'm glad you're trying." The conversation continued, each member of the family testing the waters of vulnerability. There were no grand breakthroughs, but the evening ended without argument, a small victory in itself. As Margaret and James drove home, the quiet in the car was no longer oppressive but peaceful. "That went better than I expected," James said. Margaret smiled faintly. "It's a start. And that's all we can hope for." The Carter family was far from healed, but the seeds of resolution had been planted. Each member faced their own struggles, but for the first time, it felt like they were moving forward, together. As the Carter family continued to grapple with the deep fractures in their relationships, the emotional toll on each member became increasingly evident. Margaret and James, though united in their shared guilt and isolation, began to feel the weight of their decisions bearing down on them. Meanwhile, Emily and David faced their own struggles, trying to shield Chloe from the turmoil that seemed impossible to contain. Margaret stood in her kitchen, staring blankly at a steaming cup of tea. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, but its warmth did little to ease the chill that had settled in her chest. She thought back to the conversation she'd had with Emily the day before, her daughter's words still echoing in her mind. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to trust you again." The harshness of Emily's statement cut deep, but Margaret couldn't deny the truth behind it. She had let her grief consume her, and in doing so, she had allowed her bond with James to evolve into something that strained the very fabric of their family. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door opening. James entered, his expression weary. He dropped his bag on the floor and slumped into a chair at the kitchen table. "How was your walk?" Margaret asked softly, though she already knew the answer. James shrugged. "It's just a walk," he replied. "Doesn't change anything." Margaret sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." James looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "About what?" "About this," Margaret said, gesturing between them. "About what's happening to us, to this family." James frowned, leaning back in his chair. "What's there to talk about? Emily hates us. Dad barely talks to us. And Chloe, she's just a kid. She doesn't deserve any of this." Margaret's heart ached at his words. "I know," she said softly. "But we can't keep pretending everything's fine. We need to face this, James. Together." Across town, Emily sat with David in their living room, her hands nervously fidgeting with a throw pillow. She had tried to put on a brave face for Chloe, but the tension in the household was impossible to ignore. David, ever the voice of reason, watched her silently before speaking. "You need to let go of some of this anger, Emily," he said gently. "It's not helping anyone." Emily shook her head, her jaw tightening. "How am I supposed to let go, David? They lied to us. They broke our trust. How do you come back from that?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "By talking to them. By trying to understand. You said you wanted to give them a chance, remember?" "I did," Emily admitted. "But every time I see them together it feels wrong. Like there's something they're still not telling us." "Maybe there is," David said. "But holding on to that suspicion isn't going to fix anything. If you want things to get better, you need to give them the opportunity to explain." Emily looked at him, her frustration evident. "And what if they don't? What if they keep lying?" "Then at least you'll know you tried," David said simply. That evening, Margaret and James decided to invite Emily and David over for dinner. It was a risky move, but Margaret knew that avoiding the situation would only make things worse. She spent the afternoon preparing a meal, her hands trembling as she set the table. When Emily and David arrived, the atmosphere was tense but civil. Chloe stayed close to her parents, her wide eyes darting nervously between Margaret and James. The meal began quietly, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Finally, Margaret cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Emily, David," she began, her voice steady but soft. "Thank you for coming. I know things have been difficult lately, but I want us to talk. To really talk." Emily set down her fork, her gaze sharp. "And what exactly do you want to talk about, Mom?" Margaret took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "About what's happened. About how we've all been hurt." "You mean about how you and James hurt us?" Emily shot back, her tone icy. "Emily," David said warningly, placing a hand on her arm. "No," Margaret said, raising a hand. "He's right. I did hurt you. And I'm so sorry for that. I let my grief cloud my judgment, and I leaned on James in ways I shouldn't have. But it was never my intention to hurt this family." Emily's expression softened slightly, though the mistrust in her eyes remained. "Then why did it feel like you were hiding something? Why did it feel like you didn't care about what it was doing to us? I do care, Margaret said, her voice trembling. I care more than you know. And that's why I'm asking for your forgiveness. For the chance to make things right. The conversation was far from easy, but it marked a turning point for the Carter family. While Emily's mistrust didn't disappear overnight, she began to see the cracks in Margaret's armor, the vulnerability and regret that had been hidden beneath the surface. For James, the dinner was both a relief and a challenge. He knew that the road to rebuilding their family would be long and difficult, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that it might be possible. As the evening ended, Margaret walked Emily and David to the door. Chloe hugged her grandmother tightly, her small voice filled with sincerity. I miss you, Grandma. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she held her granddaughter close. I miss you too, sweetheart. Emily watched the exchange silently, her emotions conflicting. When Margaret turned to her, she hesitated before speaking. We're not there yet, Emily said quietly. But I'm willing to try. Margaret nodded, her heart heavy with both sorrow and hope. That's all I can ask. As the Carter family inched closer to resolution, Margaret and James realized that to truly move forward, they would need to confront the choices and actions that had led them to this point. The weight of unspoken truths loomed large, and the only way to release the burden was to face it head-on. One evening, Margaret sat in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The room was dimly lit, the shadows dancing across the walls as she stared at the photograph of her late husband, Robert. His absence still felt like an open wound, one that had driven her closer to James in ways she hadn't anticipated. James entered the room quietly, sensing her distress. Grandma, he said softly, sitting down beside her. What's wrong? Margaret hesitated, her voice trembling as she spoke. I've been thinking about your grandfather, she admitted. About how much I relied on him. And how much I've relied on you since he's been gone. James frowned, his expression filled with concern. You don't have to apologize for that, he said. We've been there for each other. That's what family is for. Margaret shook her head, her eyes glistening with tears. But I've let my grief cloud my judgment, she said. I've leaned on you too much, James. And it's caused problems for all of us. James reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. We both made choices, he said. But we can't keep punishing ourselves for them. We have to move forward. Meanwhile, Emily was grappling with her own struggles. Her conversations with David had become tense as she tried to reconcile her suspicions with her desire to repair the family. One evening, as they sat together in their bedroom, David broached the subject again. Emily, you've been holding on to this for so long, he said gently. It's not healthy, for you or for the family. Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't know how to let it go, she admitted. I feel like there are so many unanswered questions. Then ask them, David said simply. But be prepared for the answers. Determined to confront the past, Emily called Margaret the next day. Mom, she said, her tone hesitant. Can we talk? I need to get some things off my chest. Margaret's heart raced, but she agreed. Of course, she said. Come by this afternoon. When Emily arrived, the atmosphere was tense but purposeful. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. Mom, Emily began, her voice steady but strained. I need to understand why things happened the way they did. Why you and James grew so close. Why it felt like you were shutting the rest of us out. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands trembling. Emily, I was lost after your father passed, she said. I felt like my world had been turned upside down, and James. He was there for me in a way I didn't expect. He understood my grief because he was grieving too. Emily frowned, her gaze piercing. But it was more than that, wasn't it? The way you two acted, it wasn't normal. Margaret's chest tightened, and she looked away. I let the lines blur, she admitted. I leaned on him too much, and it made things complicated. But it was never inappropriate, Emily. I promise you that. Emily studied her mother for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Do you really believe that?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Yes," she said. "But I also know that I made mistakes. And I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, for the way I made you feel." The conversation was a turning point for Emily. While she still harbored doubts, she began to see her mother's vulnerability and humanity in a new light. The anger that had fueled her for so long began to ebb, replaced by a tentative hope for reconciliation. Later that evening, Emily spoke with David about her conversation with Margaret. "She was honest with me," Emily said, her voice thoughtful. "For the first time, it felt like she wasn't holding anything back." David nodded, his expression encouraging. "That's a good sign," he said. "Maybe it's the start of something better." For Margaret and James, confronting the past was both painful and necessary. It allowed them to begin letting go of the guilt and shame that had weighed them down for so long. While the road ahead was still uncertain, they took comfort in the fact that they were no longer facing it alone. As Margaret sat with James later that night, she reached for his hand, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "We've come a long way," she said. "But we still have work to do." James nodded, his gaze resolute. "We'll get there," he said. "One step at a time." The fragile balance the Carter family was attempting to maintain felt as though it was on the verge of collapse. Each member was carrying their own burden of guilt, grief, and confusion. The conversations became heavier, the silences more charged. It seemed inevitable that someone would break under the strain, and Margaret feared she might be the first. Margaret spent her mornings staring out of her window, watching the world pass by without feeling a part of it. Her once vibrant garden, a sanctuary, now mirrored her inner turmoil, overgrown and neglected. She had started skipping her routine phone calls with Emily, afraid of the accusatory undertones that had become a staple of their conversations. She wasn't avoiding her daughter entirely, but she didn't know how to bridge the widening gap. James, meanwhile, retreated further into himself. He avoided Margaret more than usual, spending hours walking aimlessly through the neighborhood or burying himself in meaningless tasks around the house. On the rare occasions they spoke, their conversations were short and stilted, a stark contrast to the bond they once shared. One evening, as Margaret sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of tea, James entered the room. He looked exhausted, the weight of their shared secret etched into every line of his face. Margaret offered him a small smile, but he didn't return it. "We need to talk," James said, his voice heavy. Margaret nodded, her stomach knotting. "'Kay. What's on your mind?" James sat across from her, his gaze fixed on the table. "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for me to leave." Margaret's heart sank, and she clutched her mug tightly. "Leave? Why?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I feel like I'm making things worse. Mom doesn't trust me. Chloe barely speaks to me. And I don't think you're happy either." Margaret reached out, placing a hand over his. "James, you're not the problem. We're in this together." "But that's just it," James said, his voice rising slightly. "Maybe we shouldn't be. Maybe I need to give everyone space. To give you space." Margaret's chest tightened, and she struggled to find the right words. "You don't have to leave, James. We can fix this." James shook his head, his expression resolute. "I don't think we can, Grandma. At least, not while I'm here." The next day, James began packing his things. Margaret watched from the doorway of his room, her heart breaking. She wanted to stop him, to tell him that leaving wouldn't solve anything, but she couldn't find the words. Emily arrived later that afternoon, having heard about James's decision from Chloe. She found her mother sitting in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Is it true?" Emily asked, her tone guarded. "Is James leaving?" Margaret nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "He thinks it's for the best." Emily frowned, her arms crossing over her chest. "Do you?" Margaret hesitated before replying. "I don't know. Maybe he's right. Maybe we do need some space." Emily studied her mother, her expression unreadable. "Do you think space is going to fix this?" "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "But I don't know what else to do." When James left the next morning, the house felt emptier than ever. Margaret stood at the window, watching as he drove away, tears streaming down her face. She felt as though a part of herself had been ripped away, leaving a gaping void she didn't know how to fill. Emily visited later that day. Her presence both a comfort and a reminder of the tension that still lingered between them. "Mom," Emily said softly, sitting beside her on the couch. "We need to figure this out. For the family's sake." Margaret nodded, her voice trembling. "No. But I don't know where to start." "Maybe we start by being honest," Emily said, her gaze steady. "With each other and with ourselves." Margaret looked at her daughter, her chest tightening. "I want to fix this, Emily. Really do. But I don't know if I have the strength." Emily placed a hand on her mother's shoulder, her voice firm but kind. "You're stronger than you think, Mom. And we'll get through this. Together." As Margaret sat alone that evening, reflecting on Emily's words, she realized that the road to healing wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope, a faint but undeniable spark that reminded her that even the most broken chains could be mended. The path to forgiveness was far from smooth, but small moments began to break through the tension that had long defined the Carter family. Margaret and James, though still under the shadow of judgment, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and demonstrate their commitment to the family. Their efforts, however slow, started to bear fruit. Margaret stood in her kitchen one afternoon, humming softly as she prepared lunch. The smell of fresh bread filled the air, a small comfort in a house that had known so much turmoil. She was startled when the doorbell rang, and she opened the door to find Chloe standing there, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "Chloe," Margaret said, her voice tinged with surprise. "What a lovely surprise. Come in." Chloe stepped inside, handing her the flowers. "I thought these might brighten your day," she said with a shy smile. Margaret's heart swelled, and she hugged her granddaughter tightly. "They're beautiful, sweetheart. Thank you." As they sat together in the living room, Chloe hesitated before speaking. "Grandma, I know things have been weird lately, but I miss spending time with you." Margaret reached out, taking Chloe's hand in hers. "I miss you too," she said softly. "And I'm so sorry for everything that's happened. I never wanted to hurt you or anyone else." Chloe nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "No. I think everyone's just trying to figure things out." Meanwhile, James found himself reconnecting with David during an impromptu project in the garage. David was repairing an old lawnmower, and James offered to help, eager to bridge the growing distance between them. "You know," David said as they worked, "I used to fix this thing all the time with your grandpa. He was always better at it than me." James smiled faintly, wiping his hands on a rag. "He was good at a lot of things." David paused, looking at his son. "You've been working hard to help your grandma. Can see that." James glanced at him, surprised. "Thanks. I want to make things right." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's all any of us can do." The progress wasn't limited to Margaret and James. Emily, too, found herself softening, though she still struggled with lingering doubts. During a family dinner hosted at her home, she watched as Margaret helped Chloe set the table, the two of them chatting and laughing as they worked. For the first time in months, Emily felt a pang of something other than suspicion. She saw her mother as she once had, a loving, devoted grandmother who wanted nothing more than to hold her family together. "Mom," Emily said softly as she approached Margaret in the kitchen. "Thank you for coming tonight. Means a lot." Margaret turned to her, surprised by the warmth in her daughter's voice. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't miss it." Emily hesitated, then added, "I know it's going to take time, but I want to believe in us again. In this family." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "So do I." The evening ended with the family gathered around the living room, sharing stories and laughter. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, glances that lingered too long, but it was a start. As Margaret sat beside James, watching Chloe animatedly tell a story about her school project, she felt a flicker of hope. It was fragile like a candle in the wind, but it was there. "We're getting there," James said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Margaret nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yes," she said. "We are." The Carter family wasn't whole yet, but the glimmer of hope that had been absent for so long was beginning to shine. Margaret and James knew they still had a long way to go, but for the first time in months, the path forward didn't seem so impossible. As the Carter family navigated the aftermath of their revelations, the atmosphere in the household shifted. Tension still lingered, but beneath it, there was a tentative willingness to heal. Margaret and James, while still bearing the weight of their bond, began to embrace the difficult work of rebuilding trust and mending relationships. Margaret stood in her kitchen, carefully arranging a bouquet of daisies. The flowers were a gift from Chloe, a small gesture of goodwill that warmed her heart. She glanced at the clock. Emily and David were due to arrive for dinner in less than an hour. "Grandma!" James's voice called from the hallway. "In here," Margaret replied. James appeared in the doorway, a nervous energy about him. "Do you think tonight will go okay?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Margaret smiled softly. "I think it's a step in the right direction," she said. "And that's all we can ask for." James nodded, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. "What if it's not enough?" "It will be," Margaret said firmly. "'Cause we're trying. And that's what matters." When Emily and David arrived, the atmosphere was cautious but not hostile. They exchanged pleasantries, and Chloe's cheerful chatter filled the silences that might otherwise have been uncomfortable. As they sat around the dinner table, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The meal began smoothly with conversations about work, school, and everyday life. For the first time in months, the family seemed to find common ground. But as dessert was served, the discussion turned more serious. "Mom," Emily began, setting her fork down, "I want to thank you for making an effort. It hasn't gone unnoticed." Margaret's chest tightened, and she nodded. "I'm glad you feel that way, Emily. I've been trying." David chimed in, his tone measured. "We all have. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that." James, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "I know I haven't made things easy," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I want you to know that I regret how everything unfolded. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Emily's gaze softened, and she gave a small nod. "I believe you, James. And I appreciate you saying that." Later that evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Margaret took a deep breath and addressed them all. "I know we have a long way to go," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But I want to thank you all for being here tonight. It means more to me than you know." Chloe smiled, leaning against her father. "We'll get there, Grandma. Just takes time." Emily reached over, placing a hand on Margaret's. "Chloe's right. It's not going to be easy, but we're willing to try." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded. "Thank you." After Emily, David, and Chloe left, Margaret and James sat together in the quiet of the living room. The weight of the evening's conversations hung between them, but so did a sense of relief. "That went better than I expected," James said softly. Margaret smiled, her hand resting on his. "Did. And it's a reminder that we still have a chance to fix this." James nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll ever be a real family again?" Margaret's smile faltered, but she squeezed his hand. "I think we're already on our way." The path toward forgiveness was not without its challenges, but for the first time in months, the Carter family felt a glimmer of hope. The fractures in their relationships were far from healed, but the foundation of trust they were rebuilding gave them a reason to believe in a brighter future. The Carter family had reached a boiling point. The weight of unresolved tensions, suppressed emotions, and lingering mistrust threatened to unravel the delicate progress they had made. Margaret and James knew that a confrontation was inevitable, but neither was prepared for what it would bring. The evening began with an unexpected visit from Emily. Margaret was in the kitchen preparing tea when she heard the knock at the door. Wiping her hands on a towel, she opened it to find Emily standing there. Her expression a mix of determination and trepidation. "Emily," Margaret said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you." "We need to talk," Emily said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Margaret felt a knot form in her stomach but nodded. "Let me get James." "No," Emily said firmly. "This is between us." Margaret hesitated, but she gestured for Emily to follow her to the living room. They sat across from each other, the tension in the air almost palpable. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Emily began, her tone measured. "About you, about James, about the way things have changed." Margaret folded her hands in her lap, her heart pounding. "And what have you decided?" Emily's eyes narrowed slightly. "That I'm tired of the half-truths. I need to know the whole story, Mom. No more excuses." Margaret swallowed hard, her mind racing. "I've told you everything I can," she said carefully. "I've explained." "No," Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "You've danced around the truth. You've given me pieces but not the whole picture. I want the truth, Mom. All of it." Margaret felt her chest tighten, the walls she had carefully constructed threatening to crumble. "Emily, please understand." "Understand what?" Emily snapped, leaning forward. "That you and James have some secret bond you won't explain. That you've shut the rest of us out. I can't keep living like this, Mom. I need answers." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. James walked in. His expression immediately tense when he saw Emily sitting there. "What's going on?" he asked, his gaze shifting between them. Emily stood, her arms crossed. "I was just asking Mom for the truth. But maybe you can give it to me instead." James's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Margaret. She gave him a slight shake of her head, a silent plea to tread carefully. "Emily," James began, his voice steady but firm. "We've told you everything there is to tell." "No, you haven't," Emily said, her voice trembling with frustration. "You've told me what you think I want to hear, but not what I need to know. Why can't you just be honest with me?" Margaret stood, placing a hand on James's arm. "Emily, please. This isn't the time." "Then when is the time?" Emily demanded. "Because I'm running out of patience, and so is David. We can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not." The confrontation escalated, emotions running high as old wounds were reopened. James's frustration boiled over, and he turned to Emily, his voice shaking with anger. "You don't know what it's like," he said. "You don't understand what we've been through. You're so busy judging us that you can't see the bigger picture." Emily's eyes flashed with anger. "Then help me understand, James. Explain it to me." Margaret stepped between them, her voice trembling as she tried to calm the situation. "Both of you stop. This isn't helping." Emily turned to her mother, her voice filled with desperation. "Then make it help, Mom. Tell me what's really going on." The room fell silent, the weight of Emily's demand hanging heavily in the air. Margaret looked at James, her heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. She took a deep breath, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Emily," she said softly, "you're right. We haven't told you everything. But it's not because we're trying to deceive you. It's because we're afraid. Afraid of what the truth might do to this family." Emily's expression softened slightly, but her resolve remained firm. "I'm listening," she said. Margaret glanced at James, who gave her a small nod. She turned back to Emily, her voice trembling as she spoke. "The truth is, James and I have leaned on each other more than we should have," she admitted. "We've been there for each other in ways that may seem unusual. But it's never been anything more than a connection born out of grief and loneliness." Emily's brow furrowed, her gaze searching. "And that's all it is?" "Yes," Margaret said firmly. "That's all it is. But I understand why you've questioned it. And I'm sorry for the pain we've caused you." The revelation brought a moment of clarity, but it also left Emily with more questions than answers. She sat back down, her arms crossed as she processed Margaret's words. "I want to believe you," she said finally. But it's going to take time. Margaret nodded, her heart heavy but relieved to have finally spoken the truth. I understand, she said softly. And I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again. James remained silent, his emotions too raw to express. But as he looked at Emily, he saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild the relationships that had been fractured by doubt and suspicion. The confrontation marked a turning point for the Carter family. The road to healing would be long and difficult, but for the first time, there was a sense of possibility, a chance to mend what had been broken. The Carter family's efforts toward healing felt tenuous at best, as though they were walking a tightrope stretched over an abyss. Each member carried their own unresolved pain, and though there were moments of progress, the shadow of their fractured bonds still loomed over them. James found himself retreating more and more, unsure of how to navigate his place within the family. He spent his days in a restless haze, avoiding both Margaret and the rest of the family. His isolation was mirrored by Margaret, who kept to herself, her heart heavy with the strain of their circumstances. One afternoon, Margaret ventured into the garden, the one space that brought her a semblance of peace. As she knelt by the rose bushes, she heard the crunch of footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Emily standing there, her face unreadable. "Mom," Emily said softly, taking a hesitant step forward. Margaret straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Emily," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." Emily nodded, glancing around the garden. "I've been thinking a lot lately," she began. "About everything." Margaret felt her chest tighten, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And?" Emily hesitated, her hands twisting nervously. "I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened," she admitted. "But I'm tired of letting it control me." Margaret's eyes softened, and she took a step closer. "Emily, I know I've made mistakes," she said. "But I've always loved you. I hope you know that." Emily looked away, her jaw tightening. "I know you think that, Mom. But love isn't enough to fix everything." Margaret nodded slowly, her heart aching. "You're right," she said softly. "But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Meanwhile, James found himself drawn to the park, where the quiet solitude offered him a chance to think. Sitting on a bench, he stared out at the empty playground, his thoughts a whirlwind of regret and longing. He was startled when Chloe appeared, her footsteps light as she approached. "Hey," she said, sitting beside him. James glanced at her, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Looking for you," Chloe said simply. "You've been avoiding everyone." James let out a heavy sigh, leaning back against the bench. "It's just easier this way." Chloe frowned, her eyes searching his face. "You can't keep running away, James. It's not going to solve anything." James shook his head, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know what else to do." "Talk to us," Chloe said firmly. "Talk to me. Mom. To Grandma. You don't have to go through this alone." James hesitated, his throat tightening. "What if it's too late?" he whispered. "It's not," Chloe said, her voice steady. "But it will be if you keep shutting everyone out." The quiet reconciliation between Margaret and Emily, and Chloe's words of encouragement to James, created the faintest glimmer of hope. Yet there was a sense that the peace was fragile, one wrong move and it could all come crashing down. As the day turned into evening, the family gathered for a quiet dinner at Emily's house. The atmosphere was subdued but not hostile, a tentative truce hanging in the air. Margaret and James exchanged a few meaningful glances, while Emily kept her focus on Chloe and David. It was Chloe who broke the silence, her voice hesitant but determined. "We can't keep pretending everything's fine," she said. "It's not." Everyone turned to her, their expressions a mix of surprise and apprehension. "What do you mean, Chloe?" Emily asked carefully. "I mean, we need to stop avoiding the hard conversations," Chloe said. "We need to talk about what's really going on. Otherwise, we're never going to move forward." Margaret looked at Chloe, her heart swelling with both pride and fear. "She's right," she said softly. "We can't keep running from this." James nodded, though his hands clenched into fists beneath the table. If we don't face it now, it's only going to get worse. Emily's gaze flickered between them, her expression guarded. Are you ready to be honest? She asked. Completely honest. Margaret hesitated, her pulse quickening. Yes, she said finally. But only if we're all willing to listen. To really listen. The agreement to finally confront their issues marked a turning point for the Carter family. The quiet before the storm had passed, and now they stood on the brink of a moment that would either bring them closer together or tear them apart for good. The Carter family had come a long way from the explosive revelation that had nearly torn them apart. Over time, wounds had begun to heal, trust was being rebuilt, and the possibility of redemption loomed closer. But the final step toward healing required honesty, courage, and a willingness to let go of the past. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Margaret's living room as she prepared for a family gathering. This one felt different. It wasn't just a meal or a superficial attempt at reconciliation. It was a deliberate effort to address everything that had been left unsaid. James arrived early, helping his grandmother set the table. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared determination to make things right. Are you ready for this? James asked, placing a stack of plates on the table. Margaret nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. Think so. It's time. James reached out, squeezing her hand briefly. We'll get through it. Together. Emily, David, and Chloe arrived a short while later. The atmosphere was tense but not hostile, a stark contrast to the confrontations of the past. They sat around the table, the clinking of silverware and soft murmur of conversation filling the room. When the meal was finished, Margaret stood, her gaze sweeping over her family. I want to thank you all for being here, she began, her voice steady. I know the past months have been difficult for all of us. Emily crossed her arms, her expression guarded. What is this about, Mom? Margaret took a deep breath. This is about finding a way forward. About owning up to my mistakes and asking for your forgiveness. James stood as well, his voice calm but firm. We both have things we need to say. Things we've avoided for too long. Margaret began by recounting her grief after Robert's passing, how it had left her feeling lost and vulnerable. She admitted to leaning on James in ways that blurred boundaries, ways that she now saw were unfair to him and to the rest of the family. I never intended to hurt anyone, Margaret said, her voice trembling. But I see now that my actions created confusion and pain. For that, I am deeply sorry. James spoke next, his gaze meeting each family member's in turn. I let things go too far, he admitted. I didn't set boundaries when I should have. I thought I was helping Grandma, but I see now that I was only making things harder for everyone. Emily listened silently, her emotions flickering across her face. Finally she leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. What I need to know is this. Can we move past this? Can we rebuild trust and be a family again? Margaret nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. That's all I want, Emily. To make things right and to move forward together. The conversation that followed was raw and honest. Emily expressed her hurt and mistrust, while Margaret and James took responsibility for their actions. Chloe shared her confusion and sadness, and David spoke about the toll the tension had taken on everyone. By the end of the evening, there was a sense of closure that had been absent for far too long. The Carter family wasn't perfect, but they were taking the first steps toward healing. Months later, the changes were evident. Emily and Margaret's relationship had grown stronger, built on a foundation of open communication and mutual respect. James had moved out of Margaret's house to pursue a new job, creating healthy distance while remaining close to his grandmother. The family began to gather regularly, sharing meals and laughter without the weight of unspoken tension. They had learned to navigate their challenges with grace and understanding, proving that redemption was possible, even in the face of deep betrayal. As Margaret sat in her garden one evening, watching the sunset, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. James joined her, sitting beside her in comfortable silence. You did it, Grandma, James said softly. You brought us back together. Margaret smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. We did it, she corrected. Together. The Carter family had faced their darkest moments and come out the other side stronger, united by a shared commitment to forgiveness and love. Their story was one of pain and redemption, proving that even the deepest wounds could heal with time, effort, and a willingness to change.